Good evening. Welcome to the Planning Commission meeting of February 26, 2019. Let's rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge of allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Right. Thank you all for being here tonight. We'll start off with roll call.
Commissioner Hernandez,
I am present.
Commissioner Polgar, Commissioner Reddick, Vice Chair Benjamin,
Here.
and Chair Holt.
Here.
All commissioners are present.
Okay, great. So just before I get warned, just a reminder to everybody to speak closely into the microphone, and we'll probably have that reminder a couple times throughout the night. Next item on the agenda, approval of minutes. So we have minutes for February 12th, 2019. Is there any comments, discussion, or motion on the minutes?
Move to approve.
Second.
I abstain as I was unable to connect.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. It's done. All right, moving on to our public comment portion of the meeting. This is for public comments on items not on the agenda. I have two cards, but I believe they're both for item 1A. So I have one that's checked public forum, but it says I wish to address the proposed development section of the LUP, and that's Peter Smith. So I'm assuming you want to speak on the actual LUP item or on general? Okay, great. We'll call you. Okay, great. We'll call you at that time. So seeing nobody else jump up to the podium for general public comment, we will turn it over to our first study session item, our only study session item, the draft local coastal plan update on Chapter 2, development. Jill.
Thank you. We are happy to be back working with you on the LCP update tonight. And before we jump in, we just wanted to start by introducing we have now Winter King, our attorney who is a partner with Shute, Mahaly, and Weinberg, which is the city's outside counsel. That is our city attorney. And Winter is assigned to the Planning Commission. So you are going to see her going forward, and we're very happy to have her here. She is a land use expert and is already marking up her binders. So we're ready to go. All right. Now, let's go ahead and remind everybody in the room that this is a study session, not a decision-making meeting, and we continue to note this at the beginning of each session. It's a reminder to the Planning Commission and to participants that we are paying attention to any potential conflicts of interest that individual commissioners may have. Under the Political Reform Act, the Commission can oversee general plan and LCP updates. However, when it comes to matters concerning specific parcels on maps, individual commissioners may need to recuse themselves. So for community, that means that you can make any comment you like at the podium. The commission will stay seated during public comment. However, when this goes back to them at the end of this session for discussion, the commissioners will need to identify if there's any particular parcel that they have concern about with respect to a conflict, and we will structure the discussion so that they can step out of the room in case there's something of that type. With that, we can get into content. Thank you. You know what? Got to turn it on. Yeah. Okay. So tonight, we are going to cover the plan developments that were presented in the updated draft development chapter. And we're going to structure this a little bit differently than we have in the past. We're going to do this in 4 rounds. This is in response to Planning Commission direction, specifically the LCP Update Committee, so that we can get more time for public comment, and everyone will have several chances. If you'd like to comment on any or all of the PDs and the draft language in the plan, you can do that. So what we'll do, and the chair is prepared to facilitate this, We're going to cover first the general PD policies. There's a series of those, and this will actually, round one is going to be the largest of our presentation pieces. And we'll also note the established PDs, which we can click through fairly quickly. And then offer time for clarifying questions from the Planning Commission, and then public forum on that portion of the input. Next, we will look at the PDs in the town center. That will be round two. And then the substantially undeveloped PDs. And then finally, we're going to conclude with discussion of North Wavecrest and the potential Dolores PD. So we may get a little bit messy with the green comment cards and the like. We'll work it out. We'll just make sure if you're not going to comment in an early round, but we don't have your card later, go ahead and just acknowledge that you'd like to speak. I'm sure the chair will invite you up. And just before you leave tonight, make sure we have a card from you so that we know who has been here and we can get our meeting notes corrected for that. Okay. Is that enough to get going there?
That sounds good. I'll just note, we have the screen in the back here that's showing the presentation up there. I don't know if it's possible to remove that little banner that's on the bottom, if they're able to just click that off or on, just so we can kind of get the full view, or if we need to turn around. Otherwise, we can either adjust or turn around and watch from here. It looks like they're working on it.
Also, we
Okay.
do have 2 copies for you. We were going to make more.
I see that the
If you could
TV folks
share.
were able to take it off up
Oh,
there too.
perfect.
So,
Okay,
so
excellent.
for the audience, if you think we're staring at you, we're actually looking at the TV
Okay.
just above your head.
All right. Okay, very good. We'll get going. All right, at your last month's study session, we noted a few general changes with the plan developments. PD is how we're going to refer to them. They are a land use designation. In the current LCP, the 1996 Certified Local Coastal Land Use Plan refers to plan developments as districts. So one of the things we just want to note right off at the get-go is that language is confusing. Zoning is zoning districts, and we really shouldn't have districts in our land use plan. So we are now going to call these PDs, or plan development land use designations. So it's a bit of minutia, but it matters a bit to us, and we thought you should know that. A few of the new things that we highlighted at the last meeting are included here, and we're going to get into detail on all of these and quite a few more tonight. So we're going to jump in to talk about comprehensive site assessments. This is a new plan development policy, Policy 2-79. This is the section of the document that is laying out what some of what we called in the subcommittee the factored policies. These are policies that apply to all of the plan developments. A preliminary site assessment, the intent of that is to evaluate sites for constraints, making sure that everything fits in a compatible way. But we do want to note that most of these topics are not new. All but the 2 that are highlighted at the bottom of this list are already presented in different ways in various PD policies in the 1996 Certified LCP. The intention with this policy is for clarity up front and early in the planning process to really deliberately put all of these components together. This assessment will affect many choices. It will establish setbacks and buffers and should shed light on build-out. Speaking of which, we're going to talk about that now in terms of these next 2 slides, net land area, and then we'll talk about base densities and intensities. Specifically defining the use of net land area for the purpose of determining build-out is an important concept of the proposed draft plan. We seek and expect feedback on this. Noting that this may seem new and different, but in practice it is within the realm of what Half Moon Bay already does. The city's density bonus ordinance was the basis for this approach and a bit of the language. Pacific Ridge and the Matucci PDs, which are built out, came out in similar densities pursuant to a sort of a reversed engineer look at their base land areas. The purpose of this approach is to establish a more realistic build-out, constrain portions of sites, especially those that are not especially appropriate for development due to hazards in particular, are not counted in the base, along with the other items listed here. Note that parcels with development restrictions down at the bottom there, that refers to those that are owned by land trusts or that are otherwise encumbered with deed restrictions for the sake of establishing open space. Also, we have a little highlight there noting for public access ways. Our text should have referred to existing. That was an omission. This is one of an example of many refinements that we've been picking up through this review process that will come forward in a future revision. So from that land area, we apply base densities to get build out. So this is presented in policy 288 for within the town center versus outside the town center. Clearly, the direction from City Council to focus and concentrate development in the town center is shown in this representation. You'll note that these two densities conform to either the low-density residential designation, the 2 dwelling units per acre outside of the town center, or to the mixed-use designations found in downtown now, which are equivalent to the existing R3 residential zoning district, which is about 25 dwelling units to the acre. So these are not made up and new build-out numbers. These were actually what I like to call born out of the plans you already have. For commercial, the PDs are specific to conform to the closest commercial land use designation that's relevant to the types of uses that are proposed for the PD. Now, do notice that for each PD, when we go forward, where there's a diagram, they are clearly marked as for illustrative planning purposes only, and that for each PD, the word estimated is repeated to clearly indicate that this is a place to start with respect to net land area and build out. The intent that we had in preparing this in this manner was to establish responsible planning criteria, show you what it is, apply it consistently, and show the math. From this, again, we expect your feedback, and we're aware that there's a wide spectrum of input about the resulting calculations of estimated build-outs. We need to talk a little bit about transfer of development rights because there's 3 approaches that are included in the draft development chapter, and all 3 of them involve planned developments. Mentioned at the last study session, the Planning Commission specifically asked the subcommittee and staff to consider options for what we're going to refer to as TDR. The approaches that are included, there's a policy up front in the document 2-18 that sets up a relationship between planned developments outside of the town center as being donors to land within the town center, whether it be in regular land use designation or a planned development designation. Policy 2-90, one of the factored PD policies, acknowledges the potential for transfer of development rights within PDs. And then finally, we're going to cover a specific donor-receiver relationship at the end of this presentation, that 4th round topic of North Wavecrest and Dolores. The TDR concept and details about it is not meant to be fully developed at this point. It is conceptual, although we did include some numbers to give some boundaries for the sake of helping us all to see how it might work. Again, this is an area where And we're trying to highlight the areas where we expect a lot of feedback, and we're starting to hear some. Provisions for housing affordability. This is a new policy. This is stemming directly from the City Council's priorities and their direction for us to be working on affordable housing and how to seamlessly work it into the fabric of the community, specifically within the town center, but in other ways as well. It also relates to the community's direction, which has been reinforced by the Planning Commission. This slide is a reminder of some of the work that we did last year in the 2 community conversations about housing and the diverse types of housing that people were really interested in having be considered in Half Moon Bay. Some of this you'll hear in the planning lingo right now is the missing middle. This type of housing can include duplexes, triplexes, garden apartments, and a number of kind of smaller scale types of housing that actually seem to us to fit the scale and interests of Half Moon Bay community members. As you saw on the previous slide, this provision also includes a 20% requirement for lower income households that it be deed restricted. This is not anything new. This is in the city's BMR ordinance, our below market rate ordinance in the zoning code right now. So this is just making sure that it's consistent, and we wanted to make sure that folks didn't have a concern that this was a new requirement. This has been in the books for a long time. All right, one more thing that we want to highlight out of these factored policies is, and this is new, the intent here is to allow for and accommodate appropriate uses in planned developments that really don't need to be subject to master planning. So, for example, to establish a trail or to continue with an agricultural use. A number of the PDs have active agricultural uses going on in them, and we've talked to some of those business owners, and they're interested in how they can add to their and support their business. And the PD policy in this land use plan, as well as the associated PD zoning designation, the PUD zoning designation is really limited in what you can do. So you'll note in policy 2-85 that we're trying to directly address this, and we're curious if we've missed anything. We've received a lot of positive feedback about it. The intent is not to allow a whole bunch of development in PDs absent master planning, but to allow what is reasonably foreseeable and consistent with mostly what's already there. We're also acknowledging that a lot of the PDs are now developed. And in 1996, or even in 85, when most of this book that you're using now was actually written, they were not. So those policies needed to be completely revamped and address their existing condition. And I'm going to just click very quickly through the developed PDs here. I'm not going to go into any of their policies in particular. Casamira is one of them. Pacific Ridge, and of note, this one was called Dykstra Ranch. Area A and B are removed from the PD because when Dykstra Ranch was considered for entitlement, areas A and B were established as open space areas, and they're really going to not function going forward as part of the developed portion of the PD. So that was acknowledged and modified in the draft plan. Matucci, mostly built out. Ocean Colony, mostly built out. Although there's a little room for infill on a couple sites along Highway 1. South Wavecrest, built out with a golf course. And then then in the town center, Main Street Park is fully built out. It's an affordable housing development. It has a buffer to the agricultural use behind it. Policies in the draft plan seek to maintain that buffer. Should any of these PDs if we have proposals for a minimal amount of development in them, there's policies that cover that. Should there be a proposal to substantially redevelop any of the established PDs, there's policy to either seek a rezoning to an appropriate designation, or to restart and produce a new master plan, which is typically a specific plan. And we've got a land use map for reference in our deck of slides in case you need it, so just let us know. And that is the end of our round one presentation. We're trying to go quickly. We can cover a lot more depth if you want it, but this is the time for clarifying questions and then your first round of public comment.
Thank you very much. So are there any clarifying questions? We can save our discussion for the end, but if there's any detailed clarifying questions of staff at this point. If it's blinking, it's on, not on.
Okay, so blinking is okay. The guideline protecting the scenic resources, the 160-foot elevation, is that, does that have some precedence in anything the city has been using prior to now?
Yeah, we did not make that up. We just brought it forward.
Thanks.
Jimmy?
For the PDs that were discussed, and I understand we weren't going into any detail, that was fine. I believe there were some planned development in the existing local coastal program which would no longer exist under the new local coastal program. I only mention that because if it's going to come up in discussion, I want to be sure to recuse myself from one of them because of the proximity to the real estate I own. And if it doesn't come up, that's fine, but I'd rather err on the side of caution by mentioning it. Thank you.
Sarah, Rick, any clarifying questions before we go over to the public? Okay, Rick? Your mic's still not on, but we heard you. Rick, you're good? Okay, very good. So we'll open it up for public comment at this point on this section. Again, there'll be other opportunities to comment on the remainder of the presentation. So we'll be a little bit flexible here. I do have two cards. Carrie, Peter, if you would like to speak at this time, feel free. Like I say, you'll have opportunities later as well.
Good evening, Carrie Burke. Yes, just want to address a few of have some questions. First of all, I did recall that I believe that Amesport Landing was a PD, and that's not included in the general plan. And just so, even though I believe it's built out, or whatever density that the city decides is appropriate, but I think it would just be important to include that. Also, I'd just be curious, I know in the implementing plan, whether the criteria for our master plan, since and now a precise plan, and how that's going to differ from the specific plan, but just to be, so we really have a lot of clarity about when and what development criteria would be necessary, or what people would qualify for in the PDs. In policy 2.11, we're using the old language of the downtown area, and I think to be consistent, and it's now called the town center. So that's just a little typo, but I think just for clarity, that would be great. And in policy 2.13, I was just still curious how we're going to regulate the amount of visitor serving or ag priority land uses. Just don't know how, like what intensity of use is still going to be and the capacity is going to be determined every 3 years, but I don't know what that measurement criteria is going to be. And also, of course, there's discussion on policy 2.17 about lot retirement, and then how that squares with policy 2.22 for development impact fees. Because if you're trying to exact some mitigation for traffic, I don't know if you can ask for that twice. So I think that you have to be very clear on, how you're, what is the basis for these two types of situations. And I was, and the same thing on the policy 2.79 on the stormwater management, the 5% in addition to the open space. And so then just wanted to be really clear and on that net area, or whether there would be any situation where the open space area and the stormwater management would be utilized together. And on policy 2.78, on the master plan, do you ever anticipate whether the city themselves would be preparing a master plan, or would those all be incumbent upon the various landowners to come up with an equitable solution to planning their diverse parcels within any given area? And just another general policy, I mentioned policy 2.91. It did say very specifically that some of the houses may be no larger than 2,000 square feet. So I didn't know if that's going to be a requirement within the PD, that that's the only house size, the maximum that can be incurred. And finally, I know there's a little bit of overlap, but then also on policy 2.134, the urban rural boundary, that has been used by the county in very distinct areas between urban development and rural development. But in this situation, I don't know whether, if you establish it within the city limits, since the current density range protects about urbanization, would you have to change it again with a local coastal amendment? So those are just some of my comments and questions, and we can talk more at a later point, but those were just some questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would staff like to respond to any of those questions?
Thank you, Chair. We can respond to most of those questions. What I think we forgot to talk about is when we should respond to those questions. If we should, I assume we should take all the public comment for each round, and then maybe you'd like us to try to respond to each round of questions as we go.
Towards the end. Towards the end.
Or towards the end before your discussion. We can do either way.
Just a point of order. You're tracking the open questions that come forward, and at the end of this, we'll have a chance to maybe review them in more detail. I don't think a public meeting is the right way to necessarily deal with everything in depth, but you're going to provide with us a list of the issues that were called out.
We can do that. Some of those were really quick. There'll be others that we'll identify as needing follow-up. So why don't you give us a chance to do that, and we'll, of course, we're going to document everything in your minutes and going forward.
Through the chair, that would be my request.
Okay. Are there any other thoughts? Yeah. So that sounds good to me. So are there any other public comments on this portion of the presentation? Mr. Ferreira.
Good evening, commissioners and staff. I wasn't actually going to speak on this item, but since lot retirement was brought up on this item, I thought maybe this is the right place to do it. And I just wanted to point out that lot retirement was imposed by the Coastal Commission for the first time in our area on Pacific Ridge. And it's not just for Half Moon Bay, it's a regional lot retirement which means that you can retire lots in Montara if they come to you cheaply enough, and that meets the Coastal Commission's definition for lot retirement. I would just remind you that I signed the agreement 14 years ago that Half Moon Bay would do a lot retirement ordinance, and so I think I'm hopeful that some steam will get behind that now, and because it would be nice to see what shape that ordinance takes and how to assess it, since we're talking about TDRs at the same time, and how these things don't collide with each other or compete with each other. It would be nice to get an idea of what's coming forward on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other speakers at this point? See nobody jump up. I think we could turn it back over to staff.
If you don't mind us answering the questions as we go when they're
I think
fresher.
that's fine. If you
Okay,
could
thank
answer
you.
some of the quick questions, and then
Right.
to Commissioner Hernandez's point, if we can just get a comprehensive response following, would be great.
All right. Amesport Landing is a bit of a planning enigma. It is not included in our land use plan, although as a PD, although it is on the zoning map. So we did not identify it that way because as a PD, it never had PD policies in the land use plan, and it was just included in a land use designation that had consistent density with it. So I'm not sure that we need to take it in or not. We can, and I'm happy to talk to Carrie about this later. I've found it to be interesting, and I haven't been able to come up with a clearer answer to it. Specific plans versus precise plans. This, the general PD policies are very clear that a master plan is required for each PD, and the type of master plan is defined and identified for each PD based on really what the conditions are of that particular site. Most of them are going to require a specific plan, which is consistent with your 1996 certified land use plan. A couple, we believe, would be okay to do a precise plan. A precise plan is not regulated by state law the way a specific plan is. A precise plan can be defined by the city through ordinance enabling language and can simplify the process. Often a site that is appropriate for a precise plan may already be in a location where there's infrastructure, for example, or maybe only has one or two parcels and one landowner, so financing plan is not required for it. So we just were trying to be a little more realistic for those kinds of sites. And in fact, some of those sites really don't even need to be PDs, but we brought them forward because that's how they were. So I hope that helps. Language in policy 2-11 with the old references to it's a residential growth management policy. This is the Measure D policy, and we're limited in terms of what we can do with that language because this is the ballot measure coming through. So we understand and appreciate that it doesn't have the exact same terminology that we've been using in this document. We have confirmed with the city attorney that we cannot use the town center as the area where you'd have the bonus density, and we'll show you those two maps later. The town center map is a little bit different than the old redevelopment area. The old redevelopment area is the area that was defined for that 0.5% bonus in the ballot measure for Measure D. So we're getting to live with that one. So a few things have to come forward as they are. I don't have a good answer on your add priority land use question. I need to, maybe Brittany does. We're going to come back on that one. You had a comment about hold on. Lot retirement 217. And how it reconciles with 222. That might be too complex. I thought I had the answer off the top of my head when you were talking, but now we'll come back to that one at the end of the meeting because I think we can answer that, and we do understand your comment about development impact fees. The stormwater management comment, the 5%, I believe that we wanted it to be an allowed use and included in the open space area, the 20% open space. So I think we'll confirm that that's in there. That was our intent. We just wanted to make sure that we had enough land set aside for a basic level of green infrastructure in these PDs where there's actually room to do it. Policy 278, whether or not the city would prepare any of these master plans proactively. My real frank answer is I don't know. I think that's a city council priority question. The affordable housing question, policy 291. And the 2,000 square foot size unit. We thought that we cushioned the sentence with the word generally. I've had other feedback about it. I've talked to the subcommittee about this. The sentence is generally single-family homes shall be no more than 2,000 square feet. We're contemplating changing the shall for a should. We have other thoughts about this. We don't want to take away flexibility, and yet at the same time the intent of this policy is for smaller units. So it was helpful to have a number in this policy. So more feedback is welcome on that, but that's why you see that there. And then the urban-rural boundary, there is a proposed amendment to the existing urban-rural boundary in this draft plan. Currently, the urban-rural boundary is coterminous with the city limits. We're showing one modification to it here in the northeast portion of the city where we have land in the open space reserve zoning district and the open space reserve land use designation. It's also entirely within the very high fire severity zone, and really is it's steep and it's a concerning area for development. It's really not set up to be developed, and we don't see it as being really applicable as part of the urban part of the city. In fact, it functions more like the unincorporated areas that flank it to the north and the south and the east. So, and those, then we have the comments from Mr. Ferrara. Yeah, this is research worthy, and we don't have off the top of the head comments, but we do appreciate this input, and we understand. And so we'll be developing more information about this as we go.
Okay. Very good.
Ready to go to round two?
Absolutely.
Okay. So round two, we've got the PDs inside the town center. This one will be shorter than round one. We're going to look at 4 planned developments. 3 of them are substantially undeveloped, and one has some wiggle room for infill. Remembering the boundary of the town center, and that the Planning Commission has guided this kind of 3 segments of the town center: the north, the heritage, and the south portions of the town center area. The PDs in the town center are located in the north and the south. We've already talked about Main Street Park, so we're not going to bring that one up again. It is fully built out, and we don't expect it to redevelop during the planning horizon. So we're going to start with Podesta. So for each of these, what we're going to show is the build-out that was specified in the 1996 Certified Local Coastal Program, and the proposed land uses from your certified document. on the left column. And then on the right column, we're indicating what's brought forward, what is changed in terms of the land uses, as well as the estimated build-out. And you'll see that word estimated, it comes up over and over again. And we think that's very important to just remember that we did our best to measure these areas and get that net land area, but that's what we're working off of. So then Podesta, as proposed here, it remains a mixed-use PD. With each one of these, we did an assessment of what's allowed now, and does that still make sense? Does it fit? Is it meeting the needs of the community? Are the land uses viable? And there's a number of other criteria that you'll see outlined in the draft plan. For this one, we brought forward the residential, and then instead of the light industrial land use, we're showing a shift to some other land uses that we've heard that the city really needs and we think this site could accommodate. There also tend to be lower trip generating uses, such as assisted living. The city doesn't have an assisted living facility. That's a concern of the community. We heard that from a lot of people during this planning process. And we think one could be accommodated here. This is also a site that was identified in the work on the Parks Master Plan as one of the possibly best sites for a community park because of its central location, its proximity to another large public use where there's some synergy, meaning the high school, and that we could also support a number of other walkable uses, such as a little bit of neighborhood commercial. So the Podesta PD, also, this is your first look at one of these little graphics that we made. This one is showing an ag pond as being, it's in that green color. It's got a 100-foot buffer around it because that would be a required buffer for ESHA protection. That golden color is an area that we subtracted from the net land area. The purple is a suggested setback. It's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to be helpful to people laying out the site. On the north side of the PD, we have a kind of a transition from the existing Highland Park neighborhood. And then on the east side of the PD, we start to get some slope going up to the high school. And there's some need for a little bit of space there in our opinion. It's not meant to be mandatory per this graphic. It's just suggesting how it might be laid out. This is also, you'll see an example of a receiver site for transfer of development rights. You'll note that the 125 residential units that are brought forward from the existing land use plan can be added to through two different methods. One is already available, which is the affordable housing density bonus. The city has a density bonus ordinance, and so those 44 units that are shown here, they happen to not really be acknowledged in the 96 document, but they can already happen as things sit. The 63 units was just an estimate of what we were trying different ways of scaling TDR. This was a starting place, so we encourage people to take a look at that and give us feedback about that. All right, and that's about the amount of detail and planning to go into for each of these, and then we can dive deeper on any of them if you wish. So moving on to the next town center PD.
Bill,
Yes.
I just wanted to pause for a second, since this is the first one we've covered and there's some new concepts that we're conveying to the public here. What is the point of if you go back to the previous, what is the point of using net acres on the first line? Can you explain the concept here? Is this something new, or is this more of a practical reality you're expressing through the planning document?
Well, I think your practical reality language is exactly what we were trying to approach. Acknowledging a realistic yield out of properties that may be constrained in different ways. In particular, in the coastal zone, we have a lot of requirements regarding environmentally sensitive habitat areas. We also tend to have a number of hazards in quite a few of these planned development areas which are not suitable for development. And Half Moon Bay's planning is all about water. There's a water course running here and there and everywhere near almost all of these PDs. Water course areas are not appropriate for development. Almost every zoning code I've seen that relates to net density that's been updated in recent years nets out water courses. So this is not, I want to be clear, and I think I mentioned that we pulled a lot of this language from our density bonus ordinance, and that in fact we recognize that this is actually how the city's yield for some of our developed PDs has turned out to be in Pacific Ridge and the Matucci PD. So the intent is to be realistic.
And it's grounded in precedent, historical precedent within the city. You mentioned Matucci, you mentioned Pacific Ridge as examples. And you also called out the Isha, or the water pond, that has a setback, and you're subtracting that from the net you're not including that in the net developable area. Is that
We're not including Isha buffers. They're required. It's hard to reduce them. There are policies that allow some reduced buffers in different situations, and so that preliminary site assessment policy would further suss that out, and maybe the full 100-foot buffer isn't necessary, but that is what we assumed in this first estimation.
And the slopes is more of a practical hazard that we're addressing when you look at that purple zone. It may not be perfectly mapped out, but it's a guidance from a policy perspective.
Yeah, no, this one, they're not super steep, but we were really trying to have a combination of things going on with this separation, which is, we've got field use at the high school, we've got lights, there's a number of land use compatibility issues with that particular side of the high school property. There is also a little bit of slope. Now, specific to slope, it's really common in the Bay Area that slopes over 30%, an average slope over 30%, is really got limited development potential. This is not just Half Moon Bay. This is not just the coastal zone. This is all over the planning environment that we're in.
And just, again, I'm kind of hitting these points because I participated in many of the neighborhood listening sessions, and I've read through the extensive feedback from the community. The Highland Terrace buffer is an example of feedback we've received from the neighborhood, from the community, and this is part of a larger set of policies that we're constraining what happens in Podesta as part of our planning process, correct?
That
Based
is,
on the feedback
yep.
from the community.
That is correct. No, we did not take the purple out of the net land area. That's just a suggested setback as opposed to a mandatory buffer. Yep.
Based on, it's informed by guidance from the community and the city council, and it's acting as a policy guide for whoever ultimately develops this property as part of the master planning process.
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
All right.
Carry on.
I will carry on to, South Downtown Gateway. So this is the L.C. Smith Estate PD in the 1996 document. It is currently wholly a commercial land use that's anticipated to be there. With the update, we brought that forward in two different configurations to allow flexibility. One is just bringing it forward as it is. The other is to consider providing a little incentive for lower cost visitor serving uses, because that is a Coastal Act priority, and it is something that the Coastal Commission has been really favoring. And this was a site that we saw as potentially able to accommodate that. And so the incentive is a little bit of an increased FAR. Now, at the same time, we also showed
You
an
mean lower cost, right?
lower. Did I say higher?
You meant lower cost.
I
Great.
definitely meant lower cost. I apologize. Thank you for catching me. Yes, lower cost visitor serving uses. And then there's also an option to reconsider the land use there as a mixed use type of build out. So quite a bit less commercial in that case with residential units. We would imagine the residential, and we plotted it out and it fit, to look a little bit like Main Street Park, which is across the street and that we've already talked about. Now the graphic here, this is one of our more accurate, and yet it's not a perfect graphic, but it's a little more accurate because the highway created, the drainage off the highway created those wetlands that are in the blue color, and the 100-foot buffer is mapped there. Those wetlands were recently mapped, so we were able to bring that forward. And so you can see the net land area is towards the east and the north of the site. The black arrows are meant to show that site access really shouldn't be more than 2 driveways, and it should only come from Main Street as far away from the corner as possible. Those are intended planning practices. They're not mandated in, some of these things are really guidances versus strict policy, but these are pretty foundational and basic things to call out in a planning document. Not that different than your 1996 certified LCP, where access is often described in quite a bit of detail in text. It's just not shown on a map. The bright green line is something that comes up in other PDs as we go along. We've tried to emphasize bicycle and pedestrian, other multimodal access. So this is showing a link of the East Side Parallel Trail that's part of your Coastal Access and Recreation chapter of the Land Use Plan. So that is the renamed L.C. Smith Estate PD, now the South Downtown Gateway. And next, this is Stone Pine Cypress Cove, currently called the Andreotti PD. We're proposing the new name for a number of reasons, but one of which is because it's mostly built out with the Stone Pine Shopping Center and the Cypress Cove residential development that people know it for now. There is still some room for infill. First of all, the shopping center area is pretty low density and surface parked. It's 2 stories at the most. City Council asked us to study the potential for residential infill at shopping centers, something that we're referring to as shopping center retrofit. These are challenging projects. They might not happen during the planning horizon, but what you're trying to do, we believe, with a land use plan with this long of a horizon, is create opportunities. And so this is one of those opportunities, will be to have some infill at Stone Pine. Not for the whole thing. We really just looked at about 1/3 of it. And then there are some undeveloped or minimally developed parcels out here off of Highway 92. You see them there's 2 or 3 horses and a handful of chickens hanging out there right now. And there's potential for fulfilling some of the city's land use needs there. In particular, we were thinking about light industrial. The city hardly has any light industrial land use or zoning designations. We also know that there's interest in different forms of residential, so we cited live work, although that's a bit of a hard land use to bring into a setting like this, but it could be studied more. The goal was to find something that served the needs of the community for a long period of time with lower, again, like Podesta, it needed to be lower trip generating rates because access from 92 is a challenge. So we do expect, once again, a little bit of feedback about that, but that was where those ideas came from. Moving on. This is a proposed new plan development. This is Stone Pine Public Works and Conservation Corridor. This is 880 Stone Pine. It's really at this terminus of Stone Pine, and it's where the city's corp yard is located now. And I'm going to go ahead and click over to the map. Whoops, where is it? The map. We don't have a map. Do we have an aerial? Oh, I thought we had. I'm sorry, we don't have an aerial on this one. What we do have on this one is, oh, that was it. I'm sorry. I apologize. We do have an aerial on this one. It's just got a lot of stuff on it that I forgot about. We have a frog breeding pond here, and it's probably like that because we've got a really, really healthy portion of Pillarcitos Creek here. This relationship of pond to creek is repeated throughout town and has resulted in some really healthy habitat. So the need for this area to be really studied for conservation corridor potential was identified in this update, particularly through the natural resources work. We've also envisioned that there still may be some room available for the city's corporation yard or another type of use like that. And once again, although it's in the town center, this is a location that really needs to have lower trip generating rates because of the access challenges, especially if we end up with a conservation corridor, and how are we going to move vehicles around or through it. So the city's corp yard is one of those low trip generating types of uses, and there could be others, but that's what we're looking at here. We don't know what the net land area will be once a conservation corridor is defined. We've spent quite a bit of time talking to our biologists about this, and just more work needs to be done. So we've gone about as far as we think we should go with a policy document. And with that, that's it for the town center PDs.
Okay, so with that, we'll come back to the commission for any clarifying questions on this section.
Okay, there we go. In the Stone Pine PD, is there some idea of what the corridor, where that would be, and how that might affect it? Because I mean, it looks it's an interesting area in terms of habitat, and just thinking about like how it's already kind of divided, and how practical that is in terms of a corridor. I don't know. Is there any additional or even kind of a basic idea of where that corridor might be?
We have drawn up 2 or 3 things, and they all need more study. And you're right, it's a challenging layout. Yep.
I had some more. Is that okay? So I misunderstood. I thought we were going to stop and have a little more discussion after the first round of discussion.
But just to be clear, we are going to have discussion on the entirety of the information that's presented tonight. This is just for any specific clarifying questions that you may have. We'll open it up for public comment. We'll let Jill continue to make her presentation, and then we'll open it up for full Planning Commission discussion at the end.
I do have one clarifying question. So with respect to the development, kind of the potential development build out in the PDs, it would be interesting to talk a little bit or hear from you how policy 216, which is about development intensity reductions, kind of an interplay with when you're thinking about some of the increases on the PDs. When you're looking at those increases, they're fairly large, and then you have this policy, which is basically essentially to say, well, if we, there may be the need to reduce intensity in terms of the development. And so how would that go back and forth with TDRs? And so that's just a question. I mean, I don't know if it's clarifying at this point. Maybe it's more for discussion.
Yeah, I'm going to suggest we maybe tackle that towards the end. So, okay, very good. Any other specific, just sort of detailed questions?
One question on Stone, concerning the 92 facing undeveloped property there. If indeed the access to those is truly limited to from 92, that's going to be a big challenge if any of those people. Sorry. Thank you. So if you truly can access those areas only from 92, and if any of those people ever want to turn left on 92, that's going to be a big challenge to work out, obviously.
Was there a question in there?
I just wanted to ask: is it by definition that would be the only access to those properties?
We've noodled on some ideas about getting access through the back and how to do that. There were a couple ways to do it. They're really limited. They weren't clear enough to actually put it in a policy document when it's involving other people's land. And we're assuming 92. The other thing, though, that I do want to note, there's a number of access points off of 92 existing in these properties that front from here up the hill to the Hilltop Mobile Home Park. Most of those are in one ownership, and the plan has a policy for not increasing points of access, but rather that access points would be consolidated along that frontage, and that has been vetted with that property owner. So that's one strategy. It doesn't solve everything, but we're trying to control it as much as possible by providing some guidance in these policies.
And sorry, one more clarifying question. So I know that when we talked about the Podesta PD, that we noted that the pink buffer area is, suggested, and it's not actually utilized for calculating the net area in this. And that's the same for all of the pink areas on all of these maps. Okay.
That's right, and we'll just be clear, those are usually setbacks, and they kind of have a distinct, they're different from buffers. Okay, you've got some more choices with your setbacks.
Okay, I'm going to bring it over to any public comment that we have on this portion of the meeting, if there's any PDs there. So if you are wanting to speak on this portion of the presentation, please feel free. Carrie?
Carrie Burke, just a couple questions regarding the town center. Jill, do we have an estimate of what the total amount of density would be allowed in the town center with the amount of bonuses that people might take advantage of? I know that you came up with a number for the infill on the outside, but I didn't know if that we have an actual number that might help us with our traffic and other infrastructure planning. And then also I'd like to understand a little bit more about the concept discussed on page 230 about pooling water connections, and I absolutely agree and think that with different housing types, that maybe the old standard of the 5/8 connection, and we can be more efficient so that we could actually achieve some more vibrant and different types of housing. But I don't, obviously that would require some work with CCWD and the assessment districts. But I just think that's like one of the nitty-gritty things that we still need to understand so that we can really have policies that could make something like this happen, so we could have some different housing types or commercial developments, or have enough capacity for some pop-ups, or just some things to actually achieve that vibrancy that we're looking for. So those were all that I had. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Ferrer.
Yes, the Podesta parcel is of interest because for many years, I've said that's the most developable property in town, except for circulation. And the school district ran into that when they were entertaining the idea of putting the junior high there. And then, too, the number of 125, according to Peter Douglas and others, was kind of a not to exceed number and not an entitlement number. And so the increases there, I think, that we're talking about need more of a buildup in terms of how are you going to deal with that circulation and what exactly do you want to put into that higher number. It all really needs to be thought out, because if 125 couldn't happen over the 25 years of the LCP, then how does this higher number expect to happen? So also regarding the what used to be the Andreotti subdivision, you know, that's an old Half Moon Bay name here. Okay, and I'm just not comfortable with throwing it away for a cove that isn't a cove. Or it's just, it was a marketing name. Okay, so I'd ask you to consider that. And regarding the 22 acres of Stone Pine, and last estimate I saw by H.T. Harvey was that there was 10 to 12 developable acres there. And the only way to handle the circulation was to have eastbound entry only, and exit down Stone Pine Road. And that was kind of the only way to deal with that. But people can have new thoughts, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Any other members of the public who wish to speak? Absolutely. Please just make sure you fill out a card and leave it with staff before you leave.
Would you put up that map for there's Stone Pine, but the map looking from above? Okay. Left corner, green spot. The frogs are breeding happily. And then there's that mustard colored all the way around. There's something that's a natural habitat. Before any of us were here, that stream was running, and you've got your nice green area running through there, and maybe a border adjacent to it. On the left-hand side, you have something that's man-made. It isn't qualifying for a protected species habitat. It was a convenience for the grower to hold some water. It's been left there. Yes, the frogs moved in, but it's not the same as that stream bed. And I'd like you to consider that instead of looking like a snapshot, like someone takes a picture and says, oh, frogs are there, therefore endangered species habitat and boundaries and protected areas. Like on Podesta as well, there's a big spot there. Those were conveniences for the farmer. And there has to be some reason when looking at it in a situation like this. Yes, frogs in the creek, no frogs in an agricultural pond. Something like that. But thank you.
Great. I'll just note you didn't need your 3 minutes. Any other? That wasn't an invitation to go back, Any other members of the public wish to speak? Not seeing anybody at this time. We'll close this section of the public comment. And Joe, did you want to respond to any of those specific questions at this time, or move on?
We can give a bit of an overview. Regarding the total amount of density, or in this case, the number of units that could be allowed in the town center, we're working on that through the build-out, so both in the basic build-out for town center for residential and commercial development, as well as if density bonuses were used on sites that would be most applicable to them, and/or receiving sites that would be appropriate for receiving transfer of development rights from outside of the town center. So we don't have that for you yet, but we will have our best numbers possible pretty darn soon. Pooling of water connections for different housing types is a really important topic. We agree, and we hope to have more information about that also in the Public Works chapter. Regarding, I wanted to share with you why we were looking at a different name for Stone Pine Cypress Cove, and we appreciated the sensitivity of the Andreotti family name, and I spoke with the Andreottis about this, and so I want to be clear, this wasn't staff just making stuff up. They were comfortable with it because their farm over on Kelly with the produce is what they really want people to think of them as being there. So it's almost to their benefit to do so. We're not married to any of these names. We're just acknowledging where they're being, we're proposing to change them. Mostly when they're being changed, it's to acknowledge the location of the PD or some other circumstance about it. So feel free to give staff direction to make adjustments. We're fine with that. We agreed with the assessment that we heard about the potential 10 to 12 developable acres here, although and we're showing 11, and also that circulation route. And I thought that we wrote about it I just haven't found this PD. And I'm going to apologize. This PD ended up being put in the wrong part of the plan. It was supposed to be presented in the town center section, and it ended up in the where are you? 100. Okay. 111. It landed one section later, so if you can't find it, keep going. Yeah, it starts there. Yep. Yeah, and then we do note vehicular access as being a policy 2-128E. Primary access shall either continue to be from Stone Pine Road. We address suggestions for emergency vehicle access and potentially a route using Highway 91 for ingress and Stone Pine for egress. We're not trying to pin it all the way down because, as we know, access needs to be designed to traverse the habitat conservation area. There may need to be low bridges or some other kinds of components to making that circulation work. So we completely agree with the comment, and just wanted you to know that that language was in there, and if it needs to be improved, we're happy to do that. The 125 units at Podesta, one of the things that we'd encourage the Planning Commission to think about with that build out, with or without the density bonus, noting that the density bonus could be added to it just as this is sitting right now, is if there's a different kind of housing, or if you want to narrow the type of housing. Maybe this is a better place for senior housing. We already think it's a great place for assisted living. There could be some other kinds of synergies about that where we have a lower trip generation type of residential development. We're noting some other kinds of residential developments where parking is really limited, and they provide car share and other modes that are really trying to restrict the ease with which it is to be a car owner in that particular housing type. Now, I see them mostly in denser areas. I don't know how they would perform here, so that's something where I haven't found an example. If people know of a good example that's more in the context of Half Moon Bay that we could go study, we'd be really happy to do that. I just haven't bumped into one yet. And finally, that comment, We really appreciate the comment about these ponds. It's interesting how they have started out as one use and turned out to be something quite different over time. It would be really great if we could move that pond south and to kind of bifurcate that property as having this side near Highway 92 for some of the kinds of uses we talked about, and then the conservation corridor really concentrated near the creek. We don't know if that's viable, but the feedback that we hear is we appreciate it. That said, there are frogs breeding in that pond, and it's no longer an ag pond, and the Coastal Act tells us that we need to treat that as ESHA. That's what it is. So that's by definition. Okay. I hope that answers questions. We'll keep going. Okay.
That does, please.
All
feel free.
right. So outside the town center, this is where things get even more interesting. We've already talked about the PDs on the list on the right side there because they're developed, and now we're going to take on these on the left side. All right. And this is just like we had our land use map. We've got a PD neighborhood map plugged in here for reference. If you need it later, just let us know and we'll dig that up. So we're going to go north to south, starting with Nurseryman's Exchange. This is substantially bringing forward the 1996 LCP, which was residential, although we're suggesting for your input potential for some small neighborhood commercial service and or something that might be more of a community-related service. Think about a small child care center, something like that. A use that is really a challenge in Half Moon Bay. There's been recent studies about child care shortage here that we've looked at in the past. So those are some of the things that go through our minds when we're trying to find something that's sort of community-oriented. There's a lower build-out proposed here at this point due to some constraints, and we'll talk about those. First of all, there we go. We're needing our biologists to take another look at these what looks like wet areas here on this frontage. They might not actually be wetlands, so we need to just make sure about that. Also, the very high fire severity area is certainly up here, and I've got two different maps about whether or not it's located here. So we're gonna check back on that one as well. Now, that said, Naples and or Roosevelt, whichever you prefer to call it, we've been calling it Naples Creek, it does have riparian vegetation, and so we're showing it with the riparian setback as set forth in the natural resources chapter. Interesting here, we aren't just taking the 160-foot contour line, we're taking the 100 because everything east of the 100-foot contour is in that higher slope area, or it's too close to the fire zone. Like up in here, you can't get out of a 100-foot setback from it, which is one of the required setbacks, the preferred setback. Some of those setbacks can be reduced, but if you have a PD and you're having a fresh plan, we don't know why you would want to do that. And we frankly, this is a moment to just note, we're expecting as staff to get some new fire planning legislation. I don't think anybody would be surprised if that comes through. So we're paying attention to that, and if our setbacks aren't adequate, we're going to have to take a quick look at those. The black arrows here, those are where we would consider vehicle access into the PD most appropriate. So no driveway off of Highway 1. This denotes the potential for some kind of an intersection alignment with Roosevelt. We're hinting at a roundabout. That isn't necessary. That's just part of the brainstorm and trying to get some feedback about this. And it does not need to be pinned down to that level in your policy document. What does need to be known is we need to do something to deal with site access because it's so challenging at the north end of town. Both of these locations here are at points that are relatively flat and can, in this case, avoid Naples. This bright green arrow is, again, this is our pedestrian bike color. In this case, we're really just intending for it to suggest a pedestrian link to someday, maybe there's a trail up the hill here, and it would be a nice place for folks to get into this PD and go up the hill. Another thing we haven't really emphasized for each of these is with all of the build-outs, including with the density bonuses and or TDR if that was also applicable, we sized open space and park areas to make sure that there was room for a park in a good part of the site that would serve at least the PD's population at a 5 acre per thousand rate. So that was something that was done here. We're not showing where that might be. There were multiple locations, and we don't, the intent of this plan is to not overplan any of these sites. We welcome the creativity of the applicants. It was just to get a few of the basic planning construction pieces into them. Okay, surf dunes. This one substantially brings forward the 1996 LCP, but it also allows for flexibility to have a combination where you might have more commercial recreation with less residential and or the other way around. Note that the density bonus units are on top of the build-out. This is true for all of the PDs, as we've already mentioned. Also, for this one, accessory dwelling units would not be counted as additional units. They would be, but they'd be allowed. So the direction for ADUs varies from PD to PD depending on how constrained they are. There are a couple of PDs where they're so constrained that even ADU units are really going to be challenging, so we're considering them to be part of the build-out if they were to come forth. This one has some good examples of suggested setbacks, in this case for the sake of a visual resource corridor along the Young Avenue coastal access route. We're showing a 100-foot setback on each side. Your existing LCP requires special treatment of Young Avenue. This is just another way of representing it, as well as a setback from the state parks lands to give a little more confidence that we're going to have a good sight line to the hills behind. This is the tsunami inundation area. We think that would be a great place for a park instead of housing, for example. So, you know, there's things that you can do with areas that are potentially hazards and or needed open space. There's multiple uses for these kinds of areas. In this case, we're showing, actually, this is the 100-foot setback from this eucalyptus area here. Now, we've heard comments from folks about, well, can't you take out eucalyptus trees? And you can, but it kind of depends on where and why. And in this case, we have a monarch overwintering site documented in your natural resources chapter. We also have monarchs there this year, and they've been photographed by many community members, and I've seen them myself. So we'd be very concerned about any alteration of this grove and would need to assess that. So, you know, that setback may have more than one reason. For access, again, this is that hint at a roundabout, acknowledging that Young is really the multi-use access point. But here's the bright green, again, the bike ped. This is new. This wasn't in the 96 document. Along Highway 1, this would be another link of the Naomi Patridge Trail. And then at the north end of the PD, Paper Street, Newing Avenue is suggested as potentially a good link between the Naomi Patridge Trail getting down to the California Coastal Trail. It doesn't have to be there, but it's a way to have a bit of a buffer, and frankly, we really, again, we can't help but see a park in this corner because Miramar doesn't have one, and it would be sort of interesting to see some synergy with that. So that neighborhood compatibility thing that I've just alluded to is something that we tried to be very deliberate about in each of these PDs, which is why the visitor serving commercial, probably in the 96 document, was shown on the south side of this PD, and that's why we brought it forward here, where we're close to Sweetwood, and why residential is considered on the north end, where we're close to an existing established neighborhood. And next. So Venice, similar to Surf Dunes, it's actually quite similar, although Surf Dunes has some considerations for overnight accommodations. This one does not. Let's check out, you can see the build-outs. We'll check out the access components. There's existing viable commercial recreation uses in this PD at this time. Again, this is just south of Surf Dunes, so both of them have an adjacency to the habitat at Frenchman's Creek. Additional habitat mapping has happened down at the ocean side of this PD, and so we are showing a actual buffer and not just a setback along this edge. The same concept of a setback for the coastal access route, which is Venice, and then if we were wondering if there was some development around Venice, if a bike ped access point could be a buffer between the existing commercial rec uses if they were to stay. So that's why we're showing that there is just again brainstorming, and we're on that Naomi Patridge Trail, which there is some of that there. So let's see. Okay, I think those are my notes. Let's move on. Okay, this is new. This is an idea that we just want to vet with you. This is an idea for Upper Grandview and Glen Cree. Upper Grandview, you can see these lots. This is at the east end of Grandview, and just about all of them are not developed. This met the criteria we were using for when a PD could be considered in this update. It doesn't have to be kept as, this is just our, again, we remind everybody it's a draft. The notion here is we've got a paper subdivision with a number of challenging things. There's habitat, there's drainage challenges, the infrastructure hasn't been extended. And so from that, we also noted, it was sort of convenient that this piece over here, this is what we're calling Upper Glen Cree. Glen Cree is a property that the city owns. And in city council conversation, they have been wanting us to look at city properties that might be appropriate for residential development. We don't have a lot of city property other than those that are already used for city purposes. And much of the city property that we do own is ESHA or close to it, and not really suited for residential development. But this upper portion of Glen Cree actually it's less encumbered by wetlands and other ESHA than the other parts of it down towards the road, as well as Beechwood, which is behind it. You can see the blue wetlands that were previously mapped there. Now, in case we weren't to proceed with the full Upper Grandview Glen Cree PD, you could leave Upper Grandview alone, and it has a residential designation, and just leave it there. And we could consider whether or not you'd want to plan Upper Glencree on its own, the city property. So we thought we'd give you a quick little sketch of that, just so you could imagine that. We haven't run numbers on that, but we're happy to do that. Just trying to keep up with the input we get. So next, Carter Hill. So this one is really tricky. It's not very many parcels. It's got a water tank, this yellow piece, this coloring, I haven't mentioned that before. This is when we have public ownership, and this is actually CCWD water tank here. Almost the entire PD is in the extreme, the fire hazard area, including this orange part, but the reason why it's kind of pulled out into a different color is we're trying to highlight where the 160-foot contour line is, which is the delineation between this red and the orange. In the 1996 certified document, there's not supposed to be any development in this PD above the 160-foot contour. That's in your book right now. We don't know how to put 50 units in the lower part of it, and be real frank, and we're pretty clever. I really don't know how to do it. So we spent a lot of time measuring slopes and just trying to make this work. This one, we came up with a build out that's really more reflective of what's already there. There's a few homes there now, and to provide a little bit more acknowledging that we do have this one parcel that's not in the high fire severity zone, although access is really tough. It's coming through here. So that's Carter Hill. And this is the last one in this round that we're going to talk about, west of Railroad. So the primary consideration for this PD is brought forward. It is prioritized for acquisition, and we want to highlight why. These are graphics from the 2006 erosion study that the city commissioned with NCE, Nichols Consulting Engineers. And the green lines are showing anticipated erosion of the bluff to 2050, and the blue is to 2100 under what we're calling a managed access scenario. That means we've done everything we can to control drainage and kind of the damage that some of our use of the bluff edge has caused to accelerate its erosion. Now that's if everything goes really well. We've lost probably 100 feet by 2100. Now if in the unmanaged scenario, NCE estimated that we could get pretty close to a 300-foot erosion. And that's why we put a 300-foot setback in this plan, also anticipating that the coastal terrace prairie ESHA habitat would retreat, and we would want it to retreat because, first of all, it is ESHA and it's a coastal resource, but second, because it protects from erosion, and it's a healthy, suitable thing to have controlling the bluff edge. And we need 100 feet off of that. So we're showing 400 feet of setback from these edges, and this is why. Even in the best case, I know 300 feet sounds like a lot to some people. When you go out there, we've done two in the field community outreach events for the Shrinking Shores event that a number of other cities have done, and we put signs out where the anticipated erosion is going to be located, and it's flabbergasting. It's really important to go see it in real scale. So That's why you're seeing what you're seeing. So that land, we were looking at that because the city owns this and we take care of the coastal trail and we need to anticipate its retreat. West of Railroad is very, very close in this erosion area. Again, the yellow hatched area is our public ownership. This is owned by the county down here. These other parcels, I think, are mostly either Post or the Coastside Land Trust. And then there are known wetlands in the city-owned parcels, and we do anticipate that there are also wetlands to the east here. So we're showing a reduced build-out and emphasizing that if the city has funds for lot retirement, this is a good place to spend that money because it's part of our area, part of our responsibility in this span of the coastal trail. And that's it. We're gonna talk about 2 more PDs in round 4, but we're gonna stop here.
Okay, great, thank you. I know there's a lot of stuff in that one, so again, we will, as a commission, have the opportunity to discuss all of this at the end. So are there any specific questions of staff at this point? Go ahead, Sarah.
A couple of questions. I'll start from the end so we can go for the upper Grandview Glen Cree. In one of the slides, you showed the alternative, like how you could, another option to consider. And I just was a little confused about the upper Glen Cree PD shown there, and then in the slide before, so in that it looks like there's access kind of to the, like a little L shape coming up from the neighborhood. And then, but in the previous slide, it looked like the PD actually didn't include that area. Is that a mistake, or is that just we could actually have access? There's actually a potential for that.
We hope it's not a mistake. It was intentional, but good catch. We assumed in our original planning for this that all the access would be taken off of Grandview and could be shared. But if we weren't going to include Upper Grandview, we thought it was important to have the city consider this part of Glen Cree independently. And so moving the line down to pick up this street so that we had a point of access is one idea that we had for how to address that.
And I just had a couple others. One is, I didn't understand for the surf dunes, I think you said something about how Young Avenue had kind of some special consideration or something in the existing plan with the respect to a setback. Was that, because I didn't understand that part, if you...
I didn't bring the 96 document. Off the top of my head, I am confident that it does include a widening. And it looks like Commissioner Benjamin may have memorized what it requires, I don't know. But it definitely required more room to accommodate coastal access. I think about at least 50 feet.
Yeah, through the chair. There were several aspects, but the key the key concept is Young Avenue is an access, primary access to the beach, and therefore to make the experience of the visitor to the coast as good as we want it to be. There are limitations on development near that. There's the paving. I believe there was widening, but I don't recall the details. I noticed that it was steamrolled a couple of weeks ago and wondered if there was a coastal development permit for that, but that's another story. And there were limits on the heights of the structures that would be built fairly close to it. The idea is that you wouldn't want to dominate that perspective. So I think those are the things that she is talking about. You'll find them in Chapter 2, Coastal Access, in the current LCP. Thank you.
I found it and I misspoke, so I don't want to leave that hanging in the room. This is in your policy comparison table, which is handier than you might know, surf dunes, I think it's C, as a condition of approval, a right-of-way at least 25 feet in width, in addition to the existing Young Avenue right-of-way, shall be dedicated to the State Department of Parks and Rec. A pedestrian bicycle trail shall be constructed along such right-of-way from Highway 1 to the state beach property line in accordance with standards to be established by the city and state. There are additional access policies for development, but that's a specific one with respect to addressing Young for access. Of course, we also have zoning requirements, as Brittany reminded me, for visual resources for our coastal access routes, and this is a primary coastal access route.
I just had one more question with respect to the nurserymen's exchange. I know that earlier you had said that in kind of defining the net area of PD, that waterways would be taken out, and I thought that kind of at the north side where that black arrow is actually a waterway underneath there and that there's a riparian. I was just surprised it wasn't in anything. So it's just something I wasn't sure if it was missing or not.
We'll double check that. We don't have it on our habitat mapping or our water resource mapping. So we'll just double check it, although down off of Highway 1, you can see that there's probably some wet areas there.
Commissioner Benjamin.
Thanks. So just a couple of clarifying questions. I know that there are some constraints. We're not trying to be exhaustive in our representation of resource constraints. Where we know them, for example, we know that there are wetlands on the city's Beechwood parcel that have buffer areas around them. And I don't think we show, I could be wrong, but I don't think we're showing them the buffer areas projecting into Glen Cree. Is that correct? I wasn't sure about the colors.
We're showing a 100-foot buffer on the edge of Glen Cree adjacent to Beechwood, as well as a 100-foot buffer adjacent to Area A, and I guess that's just Area A. That was formerly part of the Dykstra Ranch PD and has been designated as ESHA. So those two sites both have a buffer that was subtracted from the net land area.
I see. Okay, thank you. On the PDs which are upland but don't currently have a waterway going through them, or that have a watercourse or some body of water, let's say an impoundment area or a natural pond, or I don't know what its origin is. But if we were to increase the permeability of that land, it has the potential to create a watercourse going all the way to the ocean, in some cases into areas that are not part of that planned development district. And I just want to be sure, as we're thinking through our policies, there is a question here. I'm just trying to figure out the right way to say it. Do our policies anticipate already that where there is a change in the watercourse in our PD, offside of our PDs, say downhill from our PDs, that we have appropriate conditions to accommodate that as part of our green infrastructure thinking? And I don't mean more detailed policies than would be appropriate for a land use plan. It just occurs to me, after all of sitting at those meetings, that may have flown past us at 1,000,000 miles an hour and we didn't get it. So if we didn't, it's on me, and if we did, credit to you.
So there's a few of those, but focusing on the one on the screen, we have factored policies that there's a green infrastructure policy that applies to all of the PDs. Some of the PDs we added additional requirements because drainage is such a needed planning matter. So in this particular case, green infrastructure for this PD may be designed as part of a larger system linked to the adjacent lower portion of the Glen Cree or Beechwood parcels, which could provide significantly more capacity for stormwater management of the upslope portion of this watershed. We felt comfortable doing that because both of those properties that we cited are city-owned. They're noted for, especially Beechwood, for potential for being a mitigation bank, and the intention is for restoration. So there's an ability to plan them as such and to link the drainage system together as opposed to just keeping everything kind of thinking about it as one site. Does that answer your question?
I think so. I mean, I was thinking at the factored level rather than this particular policy. You know, when we do if something is developed in Venice, I don't know that we would want to send the drainage down into Frenchman's Creek, or we'd probably have to find some way to deal with it in a successful, sustainable way. Probably for all of these PDs, there's broad thinking about that, but in particular the ones that are uphill. I just don't remember thinking about the ramifications off the PD site, but downstream from them that much.
All right, we'll go back and look at that, and that seems like
Thanks.
a perfect discussion topic. Okay.
Thanks.
Great, thank you. Steve, Rick, none?
Just want to step back into the policy world, and maybe this one might bring our attorney, Winter King, into the detail. The coastal trail is a low-cost visitor serving function, and it's one of the primary access points on the coast. My question is anticipating shoreline erosion and planning for continued access to the coastal trail an appropriate planning consideration for us to be thinking about as we look at these documents?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, it is.
Second question, when we were talking about the Surf Dunes PD, I heard you mention, Jill, that accessory dwelling units were something that could be included in this PD, presumably any PD, and first question is that true? And then the second question is, has City Council expressed any guidance on accessory dwelling units in planned development units, or in the planned districts?
So you had quite a few questions there. I'm thinking back through a few of these PDs. Let's start with your last question. City Council's guidance has not been applicable to the new PD policy. They did provide guidance when we brought the updated, the completely rewritten ADU ordinance to them last fall. And we had proposed including ADUs in PD areas where they're currently not really allowed. For example, Ocean Colony, my understanding is their CCNRs don't allow them. On the other hand, Matucci has ADUs in it, and that is allowed to continue to go forward. There was concern about whether or not they'd be appropriate in Pacific Ridge. Staff recommended that wholly within PDs would fit there because the houses are big, that's something for council to consider if they wish. But we did not write them in. So that was up to the PDs that are developed now, and their rules were established at that time. They had either a PD plan, unfortunately probably not a specific plan as we would call one at this point. So I'm not sure is my answer to whether or not they've opined about this. At the same time, they're asking for us to look at how to work more affordable types of housing into areas that are already developed or are going to develop, and this is one strategy for doing it, and so we're proposing it to you. So almost all of the PDs where residential development is allowed, we are not counting the ADUs in that maximum. We would count them in Measure D certificates. That's something that got approved in your ADU ordinance, and we believe is required by the Measure D ballot language. In the west of Railroad and the Carter Hill PDs, and I can't remember if there's any others right now, but those two, because they are so constrained, especially you saw west of Railroad, we would recommend that you count those ADUs towards the build-out, just because they're really fraught with hazard, in particular with Carter Hill.
Thank you.
Okay, great. So with that, I will open it up to public comments on this portion of the presentation. So I imagine there may be some. If you're interested in speaking, please go forward.
Good evening. I'm Pete Smith, and even though we didn't speak tonight about all of the units in town, I just wanted to express my personal appreciation for all the hard work that both the Planning Commission and the community development people have done over the last several years in bringing the community together to talk about the real needs that Half Moon Bay residents have. I think this document is a tremendous improvement to what was a relatively limiting long-range plan that we've had for the last 25 years. For me personally, I'm a ranch owner on the southern end of town, have been for 20 years. And some of the things that the community has articulated here recently, the need for affordable housing, the need for circulation control, the need for a reverence to the agricultural and historical heritage of the town are now being allowed by the language in the new plan. And I think it's a terrific thing. I think it works to the community good, and I applaud the effort. So thanks very much to all of you that have been part of it.
Well, thank you. We always welcome those comments. Any other speakers? Mike?
Hi, I would just add that on the Nurseryman's PUD, that the old agreement with Nurseryman's Exchange was that they would reorient their circulation to coincide with Roosevelt, which it does not do now, and that would need to be done before you move forward with that PUD. I also drove up, took a look at that Alto Road, and that's not much of a road. It's kind of, you can't have two cars on it the same. You got one car's got to pull to the side. That's not an access road. I'm not even sure it would be a fire access road. Regarding the extension of Grandview, those are kind of narrow streets in the Grandview subdivision. I think it was subdivided by our first mayor, actually, Mayor Carter. The area to the those streets, I don't see how you could have a special subdivision or a small PUD coming off one of those streets. That would be, I think, pretty dangerous for that community. And the people there like to park their cars on the street. There's a lot of that there. Maybe it's because of the intensity of habitation. But putting that one to the side, the vegetation on that property along the northern boundary was always far more intense than I think I'm seeing there in terms of willows. And I guess something has changed over the years. I don't run out and monitor that all the time, but it sure looks different from what I used to see. And I would just like to, and I see other green stuff there, and I do want to remind you about the Bolsa Chica decision of 20 years ago, when the Sierra Club sued the Coastal Commission because the Coastal Commission wanted to build a road for housing that would fill an oil polluted wet area in a grove of eucalyptus. And the Supreme Court's decision was, under the Coastal Act, not even the Coastal Commission can fill a wetland for housing. That's 20 years that decision has been in place. So if you're going to run any roads in there that you think are in wetlands, not going to happen, because not even the Coastal Commission has the ability to do that. Okay, I'll take that as my limit, but maybe more later. Thank you.
Great. Yes, thank you. And you can just make sure to submit a card. Are you speaking? Yes.
I can speak. Do I get 3 minutes?
You do.
Should I wait? Are we going? Or should I start? I should start now. Then I get more than 3 minutes. That would be even better. Tim Costello, I'm a resident in Half Moon Bay. I've worked in Half Moon Bay for 30 some odd years. I live in the Grandview area, and much like Mike alluded to, the streets, the subdivision was probably, I'm guessing, built, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, probably 1964, I'm guessing. So on the opposite side, the Highland area, if you tried to access Golden Gate Avenue, because on one of the slides you had Golden Gate going on. Golden Gate is, again, like Mike alluded to, one car. If there's another car coming, you have to pull over so that car can pass. Very much so like Grandview going in. It's the way the parking is there, you pretty much have to pull over because people get freaked out because there's cars lining the streets. Not because of ADUs, but because some of the residents are more like apartments, but I won't get into that. The other thing I'd like to point out, in the upper sort of Grandview area off of Golden Gate, there's a water course that runs down there, like Jimmy was talking about. I'm sorry, Mr. Benjamin or Commissioner Benjamin, whatever you prefer, Dr. Benjamin. But there's a water course that comes around the corner of my neighbor's property and they weren't able to be here tonight. But you can actually see the erosion in the settling of their driveway, and they have their patio just to the south side of their actual residence. You can see it's actually settling away from the house. And I believe a lot of that is from the water course that was created however long ago. And we were hoping maybe, I mean, I don't even know if it's possible to sort of migrate that slightly to the south, so maybe we don't have a similar issue like some of the residents down off of Kehoe have with that water course there, how it's eroding back into their residence or their properties. I just wanted to get on the record to say that, because the reality is it is way past my bedtime. Thank you.
Okay. Any other speakers? Yeah. Feel free.
Hi, Lenny Roberts for Committee for Green Foothills. I wasn't really going to speak tonight, but it occurred to me that this would be a good opportunity just to let you all know in a public meeting, which you probably already know, but on January 15th, Committee for Green Foothills and many supporters of saving Dunes Beach and Surf Beach area presented a petition to the City Council. It had 4,700 signatures on it, and in 6 weeks, those signatures were gathered. It was an incredibly short period of time. There was incredible public support for preserving Dunes Beach and Surf Beach as agricultural land, which it is currently being used, and equestrian, which is also currently being used. We realize that it's privately owned, and there's an application that's coming. But we also know that the Coastside Land Trust is interested in purchasing it. So we just want to make you aware of the very, very strong public support. Doesn't affect your planning, but it is a factor that I know that ongoing residents' interest in this is not going to go away. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any other speakers for this portion of the meeting? Okay, great. With that, we will close the public comment period for this section. I do have a request to take a quick break after this. Jill, do you want to go ahead and do that or respond to some questions real quick now? Okay, let's go ahead and just take a 5-minute break and we'll get back.
Hi, Winter. I'm Jimmy.
That'd be great. Yeah. Okay. So are you down? Do you just come down for? Are you? Because you're open.
And this is not the last meeting.
Basically the new Heather. Okay. Well, I didn't. I started on the planning commission, and the day after, I think that I said, Jill was like, oh, we should set up a time to talk with Heather, and then the next day, it was like Heather's not here. Yeah. You would know what Heather did. I don't know. But so I've been helping out on some various planning committees.
How's it going? Okay.
Lots to think about.
Hold your fire. We just got it. Yeah, thank you. Thanks for asking. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Hi. Let me see. Yeah. I can do it at 1. Yep. Let me put it in because I'm. Send me an email. Because I've screwed up my calendar so many times lately. If you just send me an email, I won't blow it. Because I'm getting tired. And I'm distracted. Okay, good. I'm happy to see you. Please do. Winter, this is Paul Gregoria. Hi.
Nice to meet you. Land use and environmental mostly,
Yes. Yes, I undersold you.
No, that's all right. Yeah, me too.
So if we could start getting back together so we keep it moving. Meeting till 11 o'clock last night. All right, we're getting the commission back together again. Let's go ahead and move through. Commissioner Benjamin's here, so I'm going to open up the planning commission back up. So Joe, ready to keep going?
Okay, we just have a couple quick responses to the last public comment. First off, we left this slide up because we understand that there's more vegetation up here. We know there's willows, we've seen it. But we don't have any past bioresource maps to bring forward, and that was one of our mapping criteria. So that preliminary site assessment that we talked about early in the meeting as a new policy would certainly pick up things like this. So that is there. And there was a comment about moving a water course. The idea of improving drainage in this particular case, I think it's a man-made a ditch that is the water course that's being referred to. It's possible that the PD gives you a tool for addressing those things. It's not the only tool for doing that. You could approach it in other ways, but that was one of the thoughts of potentially moving into a PD here. Okay. Round 4. We are going to talk about North Wavecrest and Dolores. This is what was considered to be North Wave Crest in your 1996 LUP. As you saw, South Wave Crest and North Wave Crest, they used to be the Wave Crest, I can't remember exactly what it was called, Conservation Planning Area. Restoration Project, thank you. And we've separated them. They're frankly completely physically separated by ocean colony, so it made sense to us to do that. Now, this PD got smaller, and why we're showing all of it here is just to help folks see why it got so much smaller and why the build out was reduced by so much. You can see there's a piece of county land that is no longer part of it. There's a 50-acre coastside land trust property. There's 80 acres owned by Post. There's the city's Smith Fields. I think it's about 26 acres. And then this, that should be Post, I think. That's okay. It's land trust, we'll call it that. It's the Wave Crest Arroyo, and it was recently purchased. So these areas that are highlighted are actually, they were purchased to be something else, preserved for open space, for active recreation, for passive recreation, or for ongoing ag, which is what's going on in that Post property on the top part of the map there. So you can see the acreage dropped to the gross acres, and then we went and worked through what net acreage might look like as well. And what happens when you take that arroyo out is we ended up with two really distinct separated areas, and it kind of gave a helpful way to think about them. And working with the Planning Commission subcommittee and from community input and other perspectives on this is why we're suggesting that the lands accessed from Wave Crest be thought of a bit differently than those accessed from Redondo Beach Road. And in particular, there's a bit of a cluster of visitors serving commercial uses here. And we have this recreation use, this active park. We're anticipating completion of the Phase 2 coastal trail through this part of the PD, and connections of that to the park in different ways. Of course, this goes north all the way to the city limits. So that is what was proposed to be the flavor of land use on the north side of this PD. And on the south side, the adjacency of Ocean Colony and some residential-friendly types of uses that are sort of scattered throughout this area, which we're going to look at in a minute, that we're calling Dolores. Churches, a child care center, a few houses. We really saw more residential compatibility with this side. We also note there is a lot of past mapped wetlands in this area. There's a lot of public ownership. Even though we took out all these big pieces, all of this yellow hatched area, these are land trust owned parcels. So there's quite a bit going on with that as well. So going back, you can see that the build out was, we actually based it on the entire net land area for the 2 units per acre off this net, which was both the north and south side of the North Wave Crest PD. And then we're really thinking about kind of a soft touch of what visitor serving commercial uses might look like on the north side, such as cabins or platform tent camping. We know there's lots of birding that goes on there. We know we have bicycle tourism potential in Half Moon Bay. This area lends itself to those kinds of things, and when you consider what we're thinking we're going to find with more refined wetlands mapping, we're really going to have to see uses that would have a very soft footprint, if not be movable. So that's where that came from. There's also policies here really remembering those erosion studies that we saw for west of Railroad and the intent to have development cluster as far east as possible, although there are some constraints on the east side of this PD as well. I took that picture just a little while ago on February 16th. This just happened. This is, my husband and I measured it. It just broke off. And this kind of thing happens frequently along our bluff edge. And so again, you saw the NCE maps, but this is one of those real life things that pieces are chunking away, and the 300-foot setback is really important to this plan and hazard avoidance. So let's talk about Dolores, because this is new, and it followed the criteria that we've been looking at. It's basically mostly a paper subdivision with limited infrastructure. It currently has residential zoning, and we've heard from property owners that they may prefer to use other tools like assessment districts to address infrastructure, and that a PD is not the end-all be-all for them. In fact, they might prefer to do it another way. So that's, we'll hope we'll get some of that input for your consideration. But what we were looking at here was that Dolores, which is right next to Wavecrest, and I'll go back a couple clicks so you can see it sits here, not including the greenhouses, doesn't have nearly the constraints of Wavecrest. So we saw a relationship of Wavecrest as a potential TDR donor to Dolores as a receiver, and we suggested a base density that's pretty low without the receiver component of it, just along the lines of what we've been doing with all the other PDs, but then a really big potential upside as something for you to consider for absorbing some of the potential build out that we're imagining could possibly happen at Wavecrest. It got other treatments, the same as the other PDs. We thought about it for vehicle access, really always concerned about a new access point from Highway 1. Thinking about bike and pet access. This is an area where we have a missing link of the Naomi Patridge Trail. It's always also really nice to get something that goes to the middle. We might not have picked the right road, but this was just a concept for how to get through. And moving on down to the coastal trail, which we know is being planned in part of a kind of a network of trails, not just one trail. So let me see what else I'm missing here. We have a suggested setback shown in purple to the greenhouses, and the kind of range of uses here. This was another site like Podesta where we thought assisted living might work really well as a compatible use with kind of modest density residential. That child care center works well. We don't see that there's really a coffee shop to walk to from one of the city's very largest neighborhood areas, Ocean Colony. We're not trying to usurp downtown in any way whatsoever, but to have a little neighborhood there is what this is. It's just a little different kind of neighborhood for your thinking about that. So that's Dolores and Wavecrest, and we pulled them onto their own because we thought we'd be probably running out of energy at this point, and we also thought they should be thought of together, and we're hoping to have some community input on those two.
Okay, great. Any clarifying questions before I open it for the last bit of public comment?
And Jill, just through the chair, for Dolores, the plan would ultimately be to put in infrastructure with Dolores. That would be one of the policies, right? Sewer, water, that's lacking in that area today.
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's open it for public comments. Anybody who wishes to speak, please feel free to approach the podium. 4 for 4.
There's an area to the west of that I think is 100% or nearly 100% owned by Post. And so I'm curious why that wouldn't be put into the other Post areas. It's also got an awful lot of wetland features to it, so it might as well be preserved. We went through that 20 years ago, I guess. And then I have another one which is on the, it looks to me as though the child care center is being put into the Wavecrest PUD, not the Dolores PUD. If you look at that, the way the lines are drawn there, yes, that's where the child care center is.
You're right.
Yes. And so, I'm not quite sure what the connection is legally for the TDR program to be moving from Wavecrest to Dolores. But I guess that's too complicated for tonight. My view of Dolores is it's wet. And it's almost always wet. And the people have a little bit of a slope. And so I was out there during the rains, and they have these gutters that run onto everybody's property to the west of them. And maybe those people are dead, so they don't know that the water is being drained onto their properties. So I think one of the biggest problems of dealing with that would be what we would call drainage, and then you get into the problem of drainage versus wetlands. Do you really, are we really in the business of doing expensive drainage to kill wetlands? I think there's probably some review points where that might be challenged. Also, I don't know where you drain it to. That's a long reach to the ocean. You don't want to go to the Wavecrest ditch, because that ends up where you've got the erosion problem. So how you would solve that is beyond me. And I'd really, you know, I like the people at Ocean Colony, but I don't see them opening up their private drainage system to receive it. So a lot of things to think about there. Thank you.
Thank you.
John Callan with San Mateo Land Exchange. One thing about all these maps, and I keep hearing about wetlands, but although everybody seems to know about which wetlands are where and what wetlands are, to the best of my knowledge, you've never had them delineated by anyone who's certified to find wetlands. Is that, this is all just guesstimates based upon visual surveys by the city. That's what I understand. But I'm sure before anybody submitted a plan, they would have someone delineate these things. I'm very happy to see Redondo Beach Road come in as access again, the way it's been shown on all these maps for many, many years. I'd just like to point out a couple things very quickly. The Wavecrest Restoration Plan, which I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of dollars was spent planning this area, it showed both residential and visitor serving uses across Wavecrest. And they try to make delineation. So where they thought the stairwell was going to go, which was close to the terminus of Redondo Beach Road, they were looking at visitor serving uses there. They tried to make them compatible. Where the trails were, they wanted some sort of hotel use that was lower cost. And it seems to me that the city is looking at an arbitrary dividing line. In other words, they're saying, okay, everything north of Redondo Beach Road should be commercial recreation coming off of Wavecrest, and everything south of Redondo Beach Road should be clustered residential. And I would just simply ask that the city keep an open mind and perhaps show it similar to the old Wavecrest restoration plan with a swath of development of residential and visitor serving commercial, because that's what makes the most sense, I think, until we get more focused on what is allowable and where. Thank you very much, and thanks very much for all the patience. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
And the
Thank
hard
you.
work. Everybody's done so much hard work here. It's unbelievable, all these years. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else, any other speakers on this portion? This is the last opportunity for public comments, so not seeing anybody jump up, I'm going to close the public comment period and bring it back to staff and commissioner discussion.
We just have a couple quick responses. Yes, we did consider taking that chunk of paper lots, paper streets out that are immediately to the west of the greenhouses. And there are a couple reasons why we didn't, but we could still talk about it. There are a couple parcels in it that are not owned by posts, so they kind of blocked a bit of that. And two, our biologist informed us that these previously mapped wetlands have probably changed quite a bit. And so we wanted to be careful about that. So it's something that we can go back and look at, but we definitely thought about it and understand the comment. Let's see. We also wanted to respond to the comment about the delineations. What's been mapped on the interior of these sites they were previous delineations or wetlands that are easily observable from a from a public right-of-way. The biologists did not go on any public property, nor did our biologists delineate wetlands anew. And so, yes, the speaker is correct. There would need to be new delineations, and that's exactly what that new policy about doing a preliminary site assessment is all about. We would like those to be done before we ever see an application, which is something that we haven't been able to require in the past. So I think that answers most of those things. We can't answer everything, but those are a couple, and that's it for us.
Okay, great. So now we can, I can open it up over to commissioner discussion, and just a reminder, this isn't our last time to provide comments. There'll be additional bites at the apple and not a decision-making meeting. So, so with that, Rick, do you want to start?
Sure. I've had the benefit of dwelling on this in subcommittee. With respect to Grandview, Glen Cree, and is it, should you separate that out or not? I would just
Excuse me, through the chair, just as a point of order, before we start with comments, staff asked us to identify places where we might be conflicted out before we begin a conversation. I live at the downstream end of the Kehoe Watercourse, which is the one that goes around Grandview that was talked about. So if that's going to come up in conversation, I prefer the opportunity to recuse myself. I don't know if that affects the structure of your comments or not, but I wanted to get that in the record as fast as possible. Thank you for the forbearance.
I'm not sure if it requires you to recuse yourself. There was a question raised by city staff, which was, should we go one way or the other? My inclination is is a general policy, having fewer planning areas makes things easier, especially if they're directly adjacent to each other. So I don't think there's any, I don't have any other deeper comment on it than that.
Okay.
I think the other feedback for the other PUDs, I don't know if you addressed the child care center in Dolores. That question was raised, so I just wanted to get some clarity on why would the child care center be outside of the planning area versus not?
Would you like to provide an answer, Jill?
I trotted right over that. I apologize. Interestingly, that's in the Wavecrest PD right now. We had wondered about, so that's this corner down here. We had wondered actually about revising that and putting it into Dolores, but we were so uncomfortable with changing boundaries since we'd already taken out chunks of Wavecrest that we didn't know if there would be an appetite for that. In fact, we can even imagine reconfiguring Wavecrest to Dolores if you were to keep Dolores, and because there's some parts of Wavecrest right here that could come into this area. We didn't show that, but anyway, you could consider revising any of these boundaries. That's just something we'd want to be very deliberate about.
Yeah, so again, my feedback is trying to simplify the planning process and not carve up a bunch of areas where we've got a mishmash. That the whole point is, from my view, whatever we can do to simplify the process and make it more straightforward. And I think your point there is something I'd personally be supportive of as you go through the process. I know there's individual property owners who may have specific feedback for or against it. But generally, everything I've seen here, I'm pretty supportive of, and I think it's very logical, and I don't have any other comments right now.
Great. I will ask, do you want to speak next, or just as you're a member of the subcommittee, I want to give you two the opportunity to sort of cover your end.
Sorry. Better. I'll go a little bit and then catch my breath. Several interesting topics have come up during the course of all four phases, and some of them apply more broadly. One that really caught my ear was one of Mr. Ferreira's first comments. Mike mentioned that our transferable development site program could potentially involve acquiring development rights somewhere north of Half Moon Bay. And as I understand our goals, we'd like to be able to retire lots within the city as opposed to lots that were, I'm sorry?
We're gonna cut you off for a second because I think you mentioned lot retirement on that. I think
Lot retirement,
I have
correct.
different notes than, and
Yeah, I apologize, not TDRs.
and it's really, really different,
Yes,
so we just want to make
thank you.
sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Good.
So with respect to our goals of conserving our property, whichever program is involved, my grasp is that I want to try to achieve goals for protecting habitat in the city. And perhaps there's a model where that might not always be our priority, but that's a priority for me. Similarly, in the past, we've talked about the possibility of selling, and now I'm speaking specifically to development rights, selling development rights to high-density transit corridors on the other side of the hill. And that furthers my objectives associated with facilitating the protection of lands within Half Moon Bay that the public desires to be open. But I realize that there's a level of detail here that's too deep for a local coastal land use plan. However, I want to be sure that we've tied up the issues as well as we can as we pursue this, so that we don't that we've adequately conveyed our values on this subject, and perhaps my colleagues disagree and they see it differently. I respect that. With respect to your comments about the monarch butterflies, Jill, in passing, you pointed out that we are aware of some overwintering sites on, at the vicinity of Frenchman's Creek and I believe elsewhere within the town. I understand that the Fish and Wildlife Service is currently considering a petition to list the monarch butterfly, so we should probably be watching that. In addition, it sets up a challenge of how we look at our eucalyptus trees, because in our current LCP, eucalyptus is regarded as a weed. We actually have a zoning ordinance section that discourages the owners from using them in their planting process. On the other hand, they are clearly valued as raptor habitat, and we recognize their value for overwintering habitat. So I think it's really important for us, as we plan going forward, for us to have a clear view about how we protect the values and we enhance the values that they bring to our community. And I don't feel like we've done that as well as we might in our existing draft of this LCP. And so that's on me, not on you. It just comes clear that it's a shortcoming. Similarly, you talked about the fire districts or the possibility of new fire regulations. And I want to point out that the retiring CAL FIRE chief came out with a fairly bold statement a few months ago saying that he felt like there really needed to be a radical change in the allowance of development in these high fire hazard areas. So I think that we ought to incorporate his comments into the record as an expert. I wish I had a direct citation. It was a speech he gave on his retirement. I think you addressed, I want to agree with you in response to the comments. I appreciate Mr. McVicker. It seems like he's gone. He commented about frog ponds and was making a distinction between man-made and natural, and I respectfully disagree. It looks to me like we have protection of both. Only when it's in current agricultural production would it be seen differently. And I'm very comfortable with protecting that resource. We aren't going to get animals removed from the endangered species or threatened species list if we don't improve their habitat. Let me stop there and let my colleagues speak. Thanks for the breath.
Absolutely. Commissioner Reddick?
Thank you. I'm just curious, the Glen Cree parcel, what's the status of it and how did the city come to own it? Not that it's relevant to the plan, but does anyone know?
A lot of people here know in quite a bit more detail than I do, but the city was put in a position where we needed to purchase it along with the Beechwood property.
Through the chair, I'd like to turn that just a little bit. Thank you. So Commissioner, former Mayor Ferreira could probably give a much more complete accounting, but my recollection is that that property was donated to the city. And it was sort of contemporary with the Beechwood matter, but it was not directly, it was not acquired in that way. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thanks. And one other question, we talked about this a little bit 2 meetings ago, but what is the state of data that we know about, if any, that would enable us to forecast how effective lot retirement and transfer of development rights might be? I know that it's fairly speculative, but is there any even anecdotal data about that?
So we've been, I'm more confident that we can answer that lot retirement question at a future meeting, but a lot of lots have been retired through programs like that. TDR is tricky, and we know a number of TDR programs that have been set up that really didn't accomplish anything. I've been talking to a colleague that I've known for a long time who's working on a TDR program that is working really, really well, but it's a completely different context. It's an urban setting. So we've been talking to our Coastal Commission colleagues about this. We're hoping that they can give us some more input about it. And of course, we have our attorneys who are just going to start digging into this a little bit deeper for us as well. So I don't have an answer on that one tonight. I'm really confident, though, that lot retirement has some outcomes that are quite measurable. You have a lot of lots here that have been retired.
Polgar.
All right, well, thank you. So kind of stepping back, actually touching upon something that Jimmy brought up, Commissioner Benjamin brought up earlier, about thinking in terms of with the PDs and the planning for them, thinking broad, kind of in the context of the landscape. So that is something, and I think this will come up more as we look at like the public works policies, and I think it's a very important discussion because some of the things, for instance, stormwater as a really good example of something that maybe just setting aside 5% is not going to be suitable or sufficient for some of these, and you may, at the master planning level, need to do better planning. It needs to be more baked in earlier on, because I think we are going to run up against certain constraints in certain areas, certain PDs, where you just can't design your way out of it. So, and right now some of the policies are written as if we are designing for the development that we're looking to have, and I get that, but the reality is that there's just certain physical constraints in our landscape, and I do think an example may be, I don't know, but I think that drainage, for instance, in Dolores could run up against that, and so I think that's really necessary. I also think of it in the context of there is obviously consideration in the planning process of hazards, but they're really about like hazards within that property. And the reality is that those properties, and we see this with, those properties exist within their neighbors, and essentially the planning has to take into account how are they not going to, how is this property or this area not going to increase hazards for the surrounding areas? So that could be drainage, that could be fire and emergency access. So I think these are really important master planning level considerations that unfortunately if you don't do them early enough, then you're kind of stuck and you end up doing this piecemeal one by one planning that doesn't work for those types of hazards and resource constraints. So that's a kind of bigger picture, stepping back kind of thing. I'm scared of the TDRs, and partly it's because I wonder how it will actually work in terms of I wonder about what I would call leakage. So how do you make sure that or how do we avoid a situation where basically we're accepting or allowing, lots of TDR transfers from areas that really weren't suitable for and wouldn't have been developed. But now we're kind of packing in a lot of development, and some of the TDR increases in the PDs, they're substantial. I mean, like 50% increases, and that's a lot of traffic and demands on resources like water supply and sewer, et cetera. So I don't want to see us basically give stronger rights, and it's not necessarily giving stronger rights, but it's basically giving more value to some of the rights and that we're transferring. That may be, that's one where I just am not that familiar with TDRs, and so it would be great. I think Jimmy previously asked, to see examples of where it's worked and also where it's miserably failed. And so that's a great opportunity to kind of, I would love to hear about some examples, maybe in a future, and discuss that in a future meeting. But they definitely, I'm nervous about them. Now, I definitely agree about the lot retirement in terms with what Jimmy was saying. I would like to keep that local. I don't exactly understand how we would accomplish some of our goals if we, it'd make it complicated to me to do the lot retirement from too far away, in a sense. I also don't know how others might feel about us selling TDRs over the hill. So I don't know that I would necessarily feel great about that. But I do agree that I would like to see, personally, I would like to see it kept local in terms of the lot retirement transfers. Or I guess it's just lot retirement, sorry, I didn't say transfer. And then, now, I actually think that, so one of the things we came up, I thought Jimmy's point about the eucalyptus, I completely understand that it's, monarch overwintering, but the current, the current LCP views it as an invasive weed because it's an invasive weed. And there's some significant trade-offs to allowing eucalyptus, and it has to be highly managed. It cannot just, it's not like something on the landscape that, like, it doesn't play nice, let's put it that way. That's what invasive species do, is they don't play nice. And so I think we want to be really careful about how running ahead with putting in protections for eucalyptus unless it's very specifically tied to, for instance, a monarch overwintering site. I also would caution against overvaluing it for eucalyptus for raptors. The mixed coastal prairie, that mosaic of grasslands, scrub, is really, and some, really actually no trees, is really what is so valuable. And if you lose the coastal prairie, that wetlands, grasslands, and scrub mix, you don't have the food source, which is what is the raptors actually, that's why we have so many different species, is because the landscape can actually support the food source for those raptors. Otherwise, they would just, the meanest of the raptor species would fight out all the rest. And so you need to have that mosaic. Eucalyptus doesn't play nice with that. Neither do any of the tree species. So keeping wetlands wet keeps the grasslands there, prevents shrub invasions, et cetera. So I think that's something that we want to be really careful about eucalyptus, in my opinion. So also, and then when you moved into fire, I was like, and another reason we want to be really careful about eucalyptus, because fire is going to be, and eucalyptus is just nasty when it comes to fire. So, and we have already tremendous fire hazards due to eucalyptus. So just some kind of points about when we're thinking about where we want to, say, we want to protect areas and stuff in these PDs, for instance. I just would, a little cautionary on the eucalyptus. The other thing that I did, sorry, I'm droning on. I'm going to stop and let somebody else talk.
Thanks. So I'll just say I don't think there's any daylight between us on how we regard the eucalyptus as a double-edged sword, and I don't pretend to have that expertise. But I can see that if we paint it with, if we just put the black hat on it, we're going to lose some habitat value. I guess I would have a small bone to pick. I wouldn't say no trees. The willows, the alders, the riparian tree species are super valuable for a lot of birds, not just Cooper's hawks and some other raptors. So just to continue and close out the other comments, I thought that Mike's comment about how we understand the circulation impacts of intensity on some of our PD sites and the illustration without prejudice was Podesta, is going to be something that we do need to craft a policy to try to understand it, because this is a location where it's a confluence of traffic for our area. And when I think about vehicle miles traveled, I'm not sure that that is a metric will necessarily capture it. Of course, under the Coastal Act, we're not constrained to only think about that. But I see, like the eucalyptus, I see a double-edged sword here, an opportunity to transfer development away from places we don't want it and intensify it in places where it is within a walkable distance of the downtown center, and yet the potential to really mess up our circulation. So I appreciate the comment, and I value it. One other comment that Commissioner Polgar mentioned when she was talking about fire and water and the impacts on adjacent areas, not just in the PD, it really reflects the fact that these are in the case of drainage, these are watershed level issues. And when we think about an analysis of a parcel, in the 11 years or so of planning commission work, I typically see an analysis of the site and maybe a buffer area around the site of a few hundred feet. This is a really good example of the kind of issue where the analysis for this kind of resource truly has to be at the watershed level, or we're setting ourselves up for failure because we won't understand the gazintas and the gazatas of the parcel with enough specificity. I don't know if there's a counterpart to watershed for fires, if there's such a thing as a fire shed, but there probably should be an analogous concept. And I hope that we can define our policies in such a way that we have that expansive way of thinking about how we plan our developments, because the key to making good decisions is framing them well, and that's what we should be improving in this area. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. So I just want to start off thanking staff, thanking the public, thanking the General Plan Advisory Committee and the subcommittee of this group, and just really everybody who's been involved in this plan, as it's come a long way from where we started. And I know the community spent a long time really talking about, what's the vision for Half Moon Bay? What do we see ourselves as? What are the values that are really important to us? And I think a lot of that is really captured in here. Really wrestling with the tough decisions of how do we preserve our agricultural heritage and our coastal and scenic resources and our natural habitats, while really respecting some of the private property and meeting the needs of our community from a development perspective. So I think we're doing good, and staff is definitely working hard to try to balance those challenges and look at that. I think a challenge for us is that we're a small, tight-knit sort of community, and but we have a much broader reach, and that folks from throughout the region, throughout the state, and throughout the nation, and internationally, are drawn to our community. So, so balancing those sorts of things. So, anyways, lots of challenges in there, and I just think staff should be commended for doing a great job in balancing all that. In general, I support the approach that you've taken on the net land area concept, and looking at a lot of this, as Commissioner Hernandez mentioned, was really input that came out of the public comment process, and capturing some of those interests that were really necessary to protect that vision and guiding principle that was set up early on in this process. So I think that's a good approach and a good way to really be responsive to that community input, and again, making sure we're being true to the vision that we have for our community. And I think it offers some opportunity for some other different uses that can preserve those view sheds and other things that are on those properties. On the Bethesda site, I appreciate the thought that have gone into alternative housing types. I think the idea of assisted living, senior housing is really good. I'm wondering if, just given the proximity to the high school and to the other schools in the downtown area, if there's been thought around some sort of dedicated teacher housing that can serve teachers who, you know, wouldn't necessarily be a big demand on traffic circulation in that area because the high school is right there. So I know there's a lot of different communities who are looking at these different types of partnerships with the school district to try to provide some of those affordable housing opportunities for teachers. So I think that's something to look at. I've always intrigued by the concepts of the roundabouts at different locations. I know they're just sort of, you know, thoughts, and we're not at a design level, and we don't know if it's in there. But anyways, I appreciate just the, you know, the thought at this level of, you know, how do we continue to, you know, meet those circulation demands. And I also appreciate the inclusion of, you know, a potential trail that could access into our, you know, adjacent open space areas. And I know that's a lot of conversation about opening up some of those other areas, and certainly not something that that is, you know, the bags out yet. But just identifying some of those goals and, you know, working to do that in a sustainable manner, if it can be done, is certainly something I'm supportive of. Interesting discussion around the eucalyptus, and I've been engaged for years on debates around eucalyptus, so I would appreciate all that. I think our plan in other areas and other chapters are really supportive of other types of plantings, native plantings and other things in other areas. I think around the Johnston House and some other properties where there's probably really good opportunities to do some native plant gardens and other things that could be really supportive of monarch butterflies and others. So I think, we should have that focus. So let's touch on the idea of potentially looking at expanding the Dolores PUD. I like the approach that you've taken in separating those, and I would be interested in entertaining just a potential, at least better understanding what the implications of that, not knowing what the, you know, all the interests are, either from the landowners or others. But I think if there's an opportunity to do something along those lines, I'd just like more information on that, I guess. You know, I appreciate Commissioner Reddick's question about getting a status report on TDRs and lot retirement and really understanding the potential there. And if we can bring that back, I think that'd be great. In general, I like the concept. I'm intrigued about the concept of over-the-hill transit corridors, being able to fund protection on the coast, but, you know, beyond our purview, I think. But certainly if there's, and I suppose they can now through other sort of mitigation programs, but interesting, yeah. Correct. So, so with that, yeah, I think generally I think we're on the right track, and thank you very much, Joe. Do you have additional comments? Any other additional comments? Okay.
I had a couple of other points just to, on specific to the fire. I think if you look at policies 2.5 and 2.3.3, they could maybe be a little more robust with respect to fire, 2.5 in particular. I do think that is a major area of concern. The language speaks to it, but it's fairly soft language in those sections. And with trails, in our subcommittee, I just wanted to mention this to the rest of the commission, because this is the only opportunity we have to really talk about that outside of subcommittee. But we've spent a fair amount of time with staff talking about trails. We've made, and there's been some interesting back and forth between the subcommittee members, between the balance of habitat versus the community's strong desire to have access to areas. So I think we've, one, expressed a strong sentiment to put trails in, but to do it in a way that both meets the needs of the community but respects the habitat in an appropriate way. And I think staff has some pretty strong, has gotten some pretty strong and clear guidance from us on that. So I think at some point it might be good for us to talk about trails as a committee, but it is an area that we've spent a lot of time with a sort of a more expansive group of city staff looking at that, and it's I know something that's going to come up at some point. The history lesson, Jimmy, this may be an opportunity for you to recuse yourself, because I am going to talk about
Point of order, I will be recusing myself since he appears to be preparing to talk about the Kehoe watercourse, which runs past my home. So call me back when you're done with just that.
This will be brief, so I'll let you step out. The upper Grandview area, prior to Jimmy coming on to the Planning Commission, we've had a few projects in the upper Grandview area, and this is just me mentioning this to my fellow commissioners who weren't on the Planning Commission when we talked about some of these projects. We've been approaching it in a piecemeal, development in that area had been approached in a piecemeal way. We had a lot of questions about habitat, frogs. We had a property owner petitioning to us that this was where he was going to retire and spend the rest of his years. I think he subsequently sold the property after petitioning to us for his particular needs. And at the time, we raised questions about the frog habitat. And so I think that this is an area where it's really important for us to have planned development. We really need to look at that comprehensively. I really strongly agree with the original recommendation of having Glen Cree and the rest of the PUD be one combined area. I think it's a very logical approach. So I have a strong opinion on that only because I've seen previous versions of the Planning Commission really struggle with the piecemeal development that's been happening there. So that's it. And Jimmy, if somebody wants to give Jimmy the signal to come back in, it'd be great.
Okay. Sir, did you have further comments?
So I had actually, with respect to, I guess I am still, one thing I did want to come back to is to, again, not at this meeting, but I think just for future discussion, I do really want to think a little bit about how our planning in the, how our planning in these, with the TDRs and et cetera, you know, how that would be interact with these policies that if we're looking at an area like density reductions because of certain issues we're running into that, you know, with resource constraints or, you know, infrastructure constraints, et cetera. So and I think that was policy 216 that I mentioned previously. And I guess another, this is actually a very specific comment, but I was a little surprised about the Stone Pine PW and Conservation Corridor. I mean, I see where the pond, obviously the pond it's an abandoned pond, ag pond, and and you know, by definition, and it has frogs, and it's by definition ESHA for that endangered species. But I don't exactly understand why why the uses are so constrained for allowing for a corridor on this property. And it seems like it's almost being restrained without, you know, because I know that in the past there were some interest and it was discussed. I'm not very familiar with this, but it was discussed as, you know, an opportunity site for park and I understand there's some constraints about how access, et cetera, but I just am, it seems like it was kind of taken off the table really fast, and so I just am not understanding that, based on the habitat concerns here. The pond is the pond. I mean, it still has frogs. It's clear that there's no like delightful corridor already nicely established based on even just looking at the aerials for it. So it's just one of the, I don't understand it. It doesn't, like that's one, like all the other ones I understood the thinking, the thought process behind it. This one I just didn't quite understand. And so, and that's why I asked earlier, like, where is the corridor? And so I was trying to get that understanding there. So.
Through the chair.
Commissioner Benjamin.
So a couple of things. It's not just the frogs. Frogs are threatened. It's the snakes. The snakes need the frogs in order to reproduce. So it has value for both. The corridor isn't just a dispersal corridor between, and you're right, it's not defined in the current map, but the frogs have to find a way to get to the creek. The snakes have to find a way to get upland and find the frogs. So there's a complicated nexus, and it's not for mortals like us, it's for wizards like Mark Jennings to help us understand what the constraints are and how we could create a corridor for traffic that doesn't have an adverse impact on both species. Does that make sense? We don't know what the dispersal and the various other uses besides the obvious aquatic habitat is yet.
Matt, a clarifying question. Is it, so there have been garter snake, San Francisco garter snake on this site? Sorry, that's a big deal.
It is a big deal,
regulatory-wise.
and I don't think we know specifically if they're on that site, but we do know that they've been found in the Pillarcitos Creek corridor.
Okay.
Commissioner Hernandez, do you have another?
But we could move the pond, right?
We cannot move the pond.
We don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
Something we
But
can
it would be-
evaluate.
I'm pretty confident that we can't move the pond, but I defer to our attorneys. I'd be very, very surprised if we could do that. So if I'm wrong, I'll admit it, but I'm not there yet. I also should respond and agree with Rick that a conversation about trails is worthwhile. I should point out that the lines that we've drawn did not include trails that would go up into areas where there are deeded restrictions on use. We've been able to try to work around that, for example, going around Beechwood. I think it's really important for us to get clarity. There are some other areas going up where we don't have those restrictions, and it might be much more feasible in those areas. So I think I just wanted to be sure I brought the consensus of our thinking to the table tonight. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate the broader conversation. One thing I did want to mention, just because I'm not sure if it was mentioned earlier, we did receive some correspondence earlier today that did provide a number of comments. So I just, for the public and for the commission, just to mention that that we do have those. I think our intent there was not necessarily to respond to those tonight, but really to ensure staff has the opportunity to fully review and provide any responses as necessary there. So with that, if there's any further discussion from the commission, Commissioner Reddick.
Could I ask one thing, because I'm intrigued by your sharing the news about the trails conversations that have been going on. Is there a process that's happening for like a trails master plan?
There is a Trails Master Plan that should be, Jill, do you want to speak to the status of the Trails Master Plan?
You're going to hear about it in the director's report.
So, good segue.
Good timing, very responsive.
So, and there was one other thing, since I know staff looks for not just onesie-twosie comments from what, but when they hear the whole commission or majorities of the commission take a position, that guides some of their thinking. And so I wanted to support Sarah's comments about understanding how water might move off of the Dolores parcel in the areas that we plan, that if that were developed, we'd want to be sure that it wasn't having an adverse impact on the wetland areas. If there was sufficient water, that it was actually going to result in the creation of a new watercourse. I think that needs to be carefully planned. Again, it's an example of that watershed level thinking. So I don't think it's news, but to the extent that it came up in comment, I want to strongly support that. I also appreciated, there was one other thing you said that I needed to jump on and say, yes, I agree. I will mention it at the next meeting if I can't get it before this. Sorry.
Well, as mentioned,
Actually, that was part of what my intent was on talking about 2.5 and 2.33 is to reemphasize Sarah's point of we have hazards that things flow downstream. I think the language could be a little stronger with respect to those policies. And maybe 2.5 and 2.33 aren't the right place to put it, but I strongly echo Jimmy and Sarah's comment on we need to make sure we're thinking through downslope and the impacts of some of the hazards that come from development.
okay. So with that, I'll just remind the commission that we'll have lots of additional opportunities to provide comments on this. I know Jill is always available to talk to us as needed and welcomes any, written comments and that sort of thing. So, so with that, I'm going to close the study session and let Jill talk about next steps, and then there we go.
My favorite part when we need to figure out what the next steps are based on your comments. So they were good. I don't know that we can be prepared in a month to respond to all of these in depth, but what we intended to do at your next meeting is we're trying really hard to bring you build out. It's been a lot of work and we're going to get it done. You have a guest who's going to speak. The subcommittee has invited Ann Riley, who is a watercourse restoration specialist, and she's going to make a presentation on March 26th. That's your next meeting. So that'll be part of the context, I think, is good for a couple of your other things that you wanted to dig into. The concept of the larger landscape / watershed level thinking relative to hazards and natural systems. So that said, what staff's going to do is we're going to loop back and look at the policies that you've called out, take a peek at some of the other ones that we know are lurking in here as well. And remember that we also have a hazards chapter and that the natural resources chapter also has a hydrology and water quality section. So we'll try to put those pieces together so you can see if there's enough coverage there, if they are consistent, if we need to increase the scope, etc. So I think that's something we could have for you next time. We can certainly have trails as a topic, and we know a number of them that are of most interest to you, so we can speak about them generally and then discuss a few in particular. But I do think that the TDR dig-in, we're going to need more time, and I don't want to overpromise on that. I don't think we're going to have time to do that before next month. And we are reviewing that new correspondence. If there's anything that we need to bring to you on that, we'll do that at your next meeting as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So with that, that study session is closed, and we can move on to the director's report.
I'll just speed you up.
So this is our chance to give you an update on your agenda forecast. March 12th, we are set for the Carnoustie Phase 4 subdivision and the housing element annual report. March 26th, we've already noted. However, we are going to need to bring a business item. We have a sewer line replacement project. It's close to being exempt from needing a CDP, but I'm preferring to err on the side of caution here, and we're going to bring that to you, and it's being noticed. So future items, some public projects are going to be coming your way, including the bicycle and pedestrian master plan. And this is a plan that has, similar to the Parks Master Plan, it's been through the Planning Commission in a couple different formats, and in conjunction with study sessions with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. And I realize now that we have an agenda item for that. We got to make sure that we loop back to that. So happy to get the draft plan to you. What you're going to see within a couple months is the draft plan and an initial study mitigated negative declaration like you saw with the Parks Master Plan. Both of those documents will be provided to you at least 30 days in advance of your meeting, so you'll have plenty of time to get through them. And that is where trails live, so you will see them there. A couple other public projects, the Ocean View Park, we're going to bring a CDP to you for new restrooms and some landscaping. The Pillar Point RV Park, we need a little more time with that, so you had a study session on it. We're not going to be ready at your next meeting. We're going to take a little longer with it. Couple private projects are lining up. I'll tell you more about them next time. I do want to note, last week I approved an addition to a home on Toulouse. It was an item that had been continued from a few months previous. We had excellent communication with the applicant who made quite a few revisions to their plan, which delighted their neighbors, but really pleased us that they were willing to do that. So that was great. A brief update on accessory dwelling units, because I keep receiving surveys about them. I also received an inquiry from the reporter at the Half Moon Bay Review on this, so I think she's going to have an article on them. So just wanted you to know, in the last 3 or 4 or so years, the city's been issuing 3 certificates of occupancy for ADUs per year, and you'll see this in your housing element report. At this point, end of February this year, we've already had activity on about 7. We've got 2 that have applied for CDPs because they're new development ADUs, and we've approved 2 that had already been applied for in 2018. We know of 2 that were approved in 2018 that are kind of pending submitting for building application, and we have 1 in for building permit review right now. So people are very happy about the new ADU ordinance. They are getting their Measure D certificates, so this is a new way of counting development, and we'll be monitoring this over time to see if this energy is just going to be at the front end of having a new ordinance or if it will be sustained. Need to announce, once again, the City Council listening sessions, because they are right around the corner. Saturday, March 2nd at the Ted Adcock Community Center from 11 o'clock to 1 o'clock is the first of 3. The next one, it will be March 3rd, Sunday, again at the Ted Adcock Community Center from 1:30 to 3:30. That session will be conducted entirely in Spanish with English translation. And then March 7th, it's Thursday evening at the Kenyatta Cove Community Room from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. will be the 3rd session. Both of the English sessions will have Spanish translation available. March 26th will be the City Council priority setting session. It will be at Adcock as well from 2 to 6 p.m. That is a Planning Commission night. The last thing I need to announce is that the City Manager's Office is out right now trying to bring folks in for the next round of our NET program. The NET program stands for Network, Engage, and Transform. This is really a citizens committee of coming in and learning about how the city works. It's an insider's view of the city, gives participants an opportunity to meet and talk with city council. There's a series of presentations by all the different city departments as well as the library. They do a thing where they dissect owl vomit, and it's really fun, believe it or not. So you never know what you're going to get to do at the NET program. Applications are due by March 21st. It will be 4 Thursday evenings, April 4th, 11th, 25th, and May 2nd. These run from 6 to 9 p.m. Dinner is served, and I think they're usually in the EOC. So we encourage participants there. A number of folks who've attended the NET program have turned up on city committees, and in fact, a city council person went through the NET program. Your newest city council person was a NET graduate. So we hope people will get involved. You're a NET graduate. Yay! That's right. I forgot about that. Okay. I forgot about that. I forgot about Glen Creek. So we appreciate every time that you correct us and keep the record right. So thank you.
Thank you. Sounds like a lot's going on. So with that, we move on to the next item, which is the appointment of a planning commissioner to serve on the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee. So do we have any nominations or volunteers?
Mr. Chair, I'm willing to serve on that. I'm an enthusiastic pedestrian and bicyclist at times, and I would be willing to do it. I'd be happy to do it. If somebody else is even more enthusiastic, I don't insist on it.
I appreciate your willingness.
I nominate Steve Reddick to be our representative.
I second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. So with that, any Planning Commission communications to report?
Yes. A couple of things. First, it was about the avoiding transfer of development from parcels that were undevelopable, directly underneath a scarp or at the bottom of a lake or in a creek bed. That was the thing she was talking about that I could not remember. I will be absent from the meeting on April 9th. I'm going to be in Florida. If you need me to call in, I'll try to do that, but I wanted to make sure that was in the record.
Thank you.
I think it's middle of next month. I expect to go to a conference, pick up a little bit more training, get a little, learn how to cause a little more trouble. That's it for me.
Very good. Any other Planning Commission communications to report? Seeing none, I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.
That was close. Like, everybody don't breathe, just keep talking. I don't have to make another motion.
Well, I was just going to say on the TV, I was just talking to Matt saying to get his help on sort of the taking stuff, and I think the TBR thing is going to be really important for the things. So I made a note that maybe like some sort of special session on that.
Thank you. I have to fix those minutes. I realized I put 2018 on one of the approvals of January, so I want to fix it before yeah, I know, but it's when you're doing, I've done a lot of research, and I know what it's like. Okay, good. Yeah,